Who were the ancient peoples of the world? And what did they know? Egyptology tells us that the pyramids were built around 2500 BC. Is there evidence that the pyramids could be much, much older? Has traditional science been able to explain why the pyramids were built? Or is it a puzzle yet to be decoded? At the geodesic center of the world, at the mouth of the Nile Delta, there are pyramids built by an early civilization clustering at 6 distinct sites. One pyramid is up a mountain. It can be seen from space. Curiously, the inside is open to the air. What was its function? Most people are familiar with the Giza Plateau and the Sphinx, but are not aware of their connection to the other sites. The sites run parallel to the fertile band along the Nile. Some sites are unknown, isolated in the middle of the desert. Other sites are known, but are only partially excavated. The monumental nature of the sites is hypnotic and stimulates our wonder and curiosity. All the sites show evidence of sophisticated engineering, advanced technology, and monumental architecture. Could the ancients have had an understanding of a superior science? Is it conceivable that there's a correlation between the sky and the ground? Why do we understand so little about the Egyptians? We are told their technology was primitive, yet the temple walls show the ancients making precise calculations. There is plenty of evidence that paints a fuller picture. Let's go and see for ourselves.
So here we are on location at Abu Raush, which is a fascinating site in that it's up a mountain.
This is a pyramid like no other, open to the air.
This site really debunks the theory of pulling stones with rope to get them up on top of a pyramid, in that the stone would have to come up a mountain before it went up a pyramid. This site is largely isolated and abandoned, and many people don't even know it's here. There's no booth, there's no guard, there's nobody up here. And I think it's meant to be largely forgotten because it really comes head to head with the theory about the way the pyramids were built. When you look around the site, you see evidence of small stones that are newer, medium stones, and then the ancient large stones.
At Abu Raush, we can see evidence of machine tool marks. We know the granite came from distant quarries. The polished, concave slabs of stone could not possibly have been made with chisels. This is not the only example of machine tooling.
We're now going to go inside the pyramid. We're walking along this ledge. And what we'll see is there's a passageway here that goes down into the pyramid, even though it's open and exposed. So let's go down. If you stand here, all the way through this area, the stone seems to be blackened, and it's evidence of high heat of some kind. I tend to think this was going on during the ancient times, but it's still very curious. There's a pit here, and the stone's obviously broken, and I think that they were heating something. This is the northern point of the Band of Peace. It's the top pyramid in a series of 22 pyramids that go from north to south. So we're now north of the Giza Plateau.
As you can see on this map of the Band of Peace, all these sites trace the shape of the River Nile. A new theory suggests that the Nile once flowed right in front of the pyramids, and the causeways of all the sites touched the river itself. Considering that the Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt, just as rivers all around the world are vital to the cultures living by them, it seems obvious that important sacred structures would be built directly on the river, not 8 miles away from it. How long would it take this river to migrate 8 miles? Looking at geological time provides yet another clue to finding out when these magnificent structures may have been built.
This probably was a seabed, and that the mouth of the Nile started here and that moved along in front of all these pyramids. One of the features of each of the sites in this area is that you can see the pyramids of the next site from the original.
From here, the volume of the Great Pyramid and the Second Pyramid look the same. When we get to the next site, we see the volumes are obviously different. It's hard not to be amazed by the pyramids of the Giza Plateau. The Great Pyramid covers 13 acres. It was constructed of 2.3 million stones weighing up to 200 tons each.
must have had a level of engineering science that it was unbelievable.
Indeed, they managed to have an order of which they based on this so-called cosmic order, which lasted for 3,000 years. No other civilization has done this.
Why is ancient Egypt still so mysterious to us? Are we looking in the wrong place? Or are we looking in the wrong way?
We look at everything through our sociocultural context, and so it's very difficult for us to look through that and see another possibility for how life could have been. And we also have to be willing to depart from our own traditional ways of looking at things. That's what's really stopping us from understanding the ancients.
We may need to reconsider what we've been told and what we think we've seen. For example, instead of thinking that the Egyptians put the causeway at an angle because the Sphinx was in the way, we could consider another reason. At summer solstice, the sun rises along the causeway in front of the Great Pyramid and moves across the sky, setting between the Second and the Great Pyramid, making it hotter in summer. In the winter, the sun rises in line with the Grand Causeway by the Second Pyramid and sets between the Second and Third Pyramids, making a short trajectory, resulting in cooler weather. It appears that the causeways are deliberately pointing towards the rising sun on the summer and winter solstices. Orthodox Egyptologists insist that the pyramids were tombs.
Of all of the wild theories floating around the pyramids, the actual wildest is the one that's accepted without question by all Egyptologists, which is that the pyramids served as tombs.
All of those concepts about it being a tomb are nonsense.
Of all of the theories for which there's zero evidence, that one has zero squared evidence.
In fact, I don't even think there's good evidence that it ever was a tomb for any pharaoh whatsoever.
I mean, it's obvious we don't find mummies in the pyramids.
There's no question you can bring up that isn't debatable. The Egyptians themselves, in at least one stone tablet and one papyrus, tell the story that ancient Egypt is much, much older than the Egyptologists think it is.
Where the Great Pyramid sits, I believe, is on a much more ancient site. Under the Great Pyramid to this day is the descending passage in the subterranean chamber. I think there's very good evidence that that was carved out in what we would call pre-dynastic times. That goes back to a very ancient date. Based on the hieroglyphics that we have, the second pyramid was in many ways regarded as the primary pyramid on the Giza Plateau. Actually, from many angles on the Giza Plateau, the second pyramid is dominant. The structure underneath it, or the base of it, was older than even the Great Pyramid. There was a platform-type structure where the second pyramid is now.
You can see from the platform that it's larger than the pyramid, suggesting there was once something else there.
Around the base is a ring of granite, red granite, and at least from what I've seen in Egypt, this is something that was often used around the bases or on structures when they were renewing them, they were refurbishing them, they were taking older structures, re-energizing them, rebuilding them.
It's demonstrable in that the second pyramid is very definitely built in at least 2 stages, the third built in 2 or more stages. I mean, we really don't at the moment have anything to even provisionally to date them with. With the Sphinx we do.
Looking at the weathering on the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure, that weathering was clearly formed by runoff from rain, from precipitation.
We have the severe weathering, which 99% of the geologists of the world who've heard our evidence concur that it is indeed water weathering and precipitation induced. So it has to have been done by heavy rainfalls in the distant past, and the question then is, how distant was that past?
That runoff is coming from up on the plateau. Follow up the plateau northwest of the Sphinx, you ultimately hit the Great Pyramid. The natural topography is the water would run down the back of the Sphinx enclosure, and that's where you see the greatest amount of water precipitation weathering. To have that surface hydrology, you need to have the plateau relatively intact. Now, if you look, currently there's a big quarry interrupting the water flow. So we know that the water flow that was causing that weathering had to occur before that quarry existed. That quarry is well known Egyptologically by inscriptions, etc. That was a quarry that was used when the Great Pyramid was built. So that means that the Sphinx must have been carved earlier. The water was still running down the back of the enclosure wall and causing that weathering before that quarry was a quarry, which means that occurs before the Great Pyramid was built. Basically, we have right there disrupted the traditional chronology.
Even Egyptologists agree that the Giza Plateau has a unified ground plan. How does the Great Pyramid display evidence of this correlation?
I do think when it was what we would call partially built, it was used as an astronomical observatory. The Grand Gallery, perfectly aligned north-south, opening to the southern sky, would have made a wonderful observational tube, essentially, looking up into the sky.
We have shafts pointing to certain stars, Orion's Belt series. We know the stars because they're mentioned in the text. We therefore can use precession astronomy to place the stars back in alignment with these monuments, in this case the pyramids, for example.
The Great Pyramid stands exactly at the center of the largest land mass on the planet. Yet, we had no idea of the position of continents until 600 years ago. How could they have known?
I've shown that Giza, if interpreted as being Orion's belt counterpart, then the layout of the three pyramids, as they are to the ground meridian, would fit a celestial meridian of these stars at 10,500 BC. They reach the very lowest point in their up and down move. Looking east, you had the Sphinx looking at the constellation of Leo. So you have two major monuments on the same site, looking at constellations that are representative of these features on the ground in the sky. We have evidence that they did it, and the alignments were there. Now, could the pyramid builders have been aware of these alignments? Or why not?
With this evidence, it would seem that it's time to rethink what we've been told.
Here we are at Abu Ghraib. You can see that there's no road, no ticket booth, no nothing. This is a very isolated area. And we're going to walk through a mango grove. If you were to get on a camel and ride south from Giza Plateau, you'd come up over the sand dune and see these other pyramids. So as we approach up here, you see a pile of rubble, but really what it is the base of the largest obelisk that ever was in Egypt. Well, here we come up to the platform of the crystal altar. You can see that it's made of quartz, if you look up close here. These little bits of crystal are coming right off it. And then We have a laser cut 6-foot circle in the middle, cardinal directions, made out of single solid pieces of quartz. So here we have some stone basins that were found by Sir Walter Emery years and years ago, and the Department of Antiquities lined all these up with the idea of maybe bringing them to the museum, and they really didn't know what to call them or what they were, so they just decided to leave them here, and they've been here ever since. But if you look at the features on these, they're actually made out of quartz crystal. We'll look up close at some of the places, but when there's little fragments that break off, it's actually a hunk of quartz. And there are these little holes inside, and they say that they were for animal sacrifices and the blood would drip through. I don't know. I really don't think that's what happened. No one has ever come up with a theory that satisfies me about what they're for.
Is there anyone who knows more about this area? Hakim Awiyan is an indigenous wisdom keeper who was born in the village of Abu Sir. He trained in Europe as an archaeologist. Hakim lived his whole life in the area known as the Band of Peace. The Giza Plateau was his front yard.
1936-37, the Sphinx then was covered with sand up to the neck, and there was my playing yard. There are tunnels. I used to walk in these tunnels. In water, I used to crawl sometime because it's narrow.
At Abu Jarab, we have a crystal altar, a round disc in the middle of 4, a symbol of Hotep, and the word Hotep means peace and food. This round disc, it's a lid on a shaft about 180 feet deep to the level of the ocean. And that is still running water in there, and you can feel it while you're in the area.
These instruments were not found in a line like you see today, it's 9 of them, but they found around the area. And there is still some more to be found.
And then we have oldest obelisk located in Egypt. Next to that altar, what's left of the what you call hieroglyph writing, that is Sufi writing. It has the obelisk and the disk of the sun and words saying the heart of the sun. Ibra.
Arriving at Abu Sir, we can imagine the ancient priests and priestesses who trained as high-level initiates here. Just as we have monks, nuns, and priests nowadays, the ancients trained initiates in ritual practices that served the highest good of mankind.
Here we are at Abu Sir, and it's very obvious. You can see the old riverbed. You can see the pyramids of Saqqara and the pyramids of Giza from here. But more importantly, you can see the old causeway, and you can imagine that boats used to come along the river, and then the high-level initiates would just step off the boat and walk up the grand causeway and through the pillars into the temple, which is in front of the main pyramid.
Spiritual connections would nourish the initiates, instilling a sense of peace and purpose. These elegant columns are carved from solid granite.
There's something about these black floors that you just imagine them being polished, and the beauty in here.
Similarly, you can see a beautiful black floor in the temple to the east of the Great Pyramid. The rituals of ancient Egyptians were dictated by the stars. For example, the ancients tracked the movement of the most prominent star in the night sky, Sirius. Through watching night after night, season after season, they realized that this star would drop below the horizon and remain out of sight for 70 days each year. Its return was awaited with anticipation because it coincided with the flooding of the Nile.
Now, what happens during those 70 days? Well, if you observe the sky, you will notice that the sun reaches a certain point in its apparent cycle along the zodiac. It's somewhere above Orion at the beginning of the 70 days. And it drifts approximately a degree every day towards the constellation of Leo. So the 70 days are bracketed by Leo and a point somewhere above Orion. That point is where the Pleiades are. In the sky it's very clear. I mean, we know what happens during 70 days. Now, assuming on the ground that the three stars are represented by the three pyramids of Giza, and that the temple of Heliopolis represents the constellation of Leo, then you have another feature. You have the Nile that separates them both. Similarly in the sky, the sun at the beginning of these 70 days is about to cross the Milky Way and head towards Leo. So if you take the three stars of Orion's belt as being the three pyramids, then you have a scale. You know their distance, and therefore you know the stellar scale that you're talking about. And if you use that scale, you work on the same scale, then the position of Abu Sir fits the Pleiades. And surprisingly, there are 6 pyramids there, and there are 6 or 7 stars there, and they seem to be in a cluster. And indeed, the sun's path is just below the Pleiades. It's not through them, just below them. And odd enough, we find the sun temples just below the Abu Sir pyramids. So we've got sun temple to sun temple. I now call it sun stations. It looks like these were the stations that on the ground the solar king performed these 70 days rituals. A bit like the stations of the cross. So you can see them in a much more archaic and grandiose way. The king went along to these stations, if you like, to perform his rituals, his passion.
Here we are at Saqqara. This is the famous step pyramid of Djoser. Djoser is a title to the king of the third dynasty, 2900 BC, roughly, said the books. The step pyramid is located in a big courtyard, much older than the pyramid itself. And you can compare yourself with the same eye. You look at the pyramid and you look at the wall, you can see the difference.
These chunks of stone in front of Hakim are quartz crystal.
Then it reflects the crystal tile on the ground. This is what's left of it. This has been quarried by the natives in the area in the 17th century.
We see the remains of a quartz floor at Giza, in the temple to the east of the second pyramid.
Now I'm pointing the jade pillar, which is symbolizing one of the ancient gods, Osiris. And jade is a word we still use to address the older people, like grandmother and grandfather, jade. It goes back to the story of Osiris and his brother Seth, the bad guy, who put Osiris in a coffin, throw him in the ocean. The ocean took him place, Phoenicia, Lebanon today, and there is the cedar tree grows, and the roots of the cedar tree captured this coffin. There it has been found by his beloved sister Isis. She cried, her tears touch his body, and they live together again for a short while, short enough to make a baby with the name of Horus.
The story of Isis, Osiris, and Horus is fundamental to Egyptian cosmology. Isis is connected to the star Sirius, and Osiris is connected to the constellation of Orion. Horus is their prodigal son.
I'm going to take you now to see that hospital, the healing with the sound.
Stories about ancient healing techniques were passed down from generation to generation by the elders. Hakim explains how sound played a part in diagnosing and healing patients.
That line of construction you see like 3 chambers, it's what's left of the house of the spirit. And it's a healing system with a sound. It's a medical investigation table. And the patient have the right to use either side of the stairs. One on the right, one on the left. So he have to follow, or she have to follow her own antenna to climb up there and choose the point where she stands. Because each point is connected to a cheek chamber. We have 22 of them, 11 on each side, no ceiling. And when you go inside, you can see a niche where the physician put his head in the niche to see what's the matter with his patient laying on this table. And that works with the sound. And the sound source is running water in a tunnel underneath here. So it's a big map of tunnels underneath here.
Let's consider that the pyramid sites along the Band of Peace are sophisticated harmonic structures, not only mirroring positions of the stars, but designed to replicate harmonic cavities of the human body. It seems that the chambers in the pyramids are harmonically tuned to a specific frequency or musical tone. Sound healing techniques were used to restore the patient's body to the correct harmonic within. This is the view of Abu Sir to the north of Saqqara, and here is the view of Dashur to the south.
Here we are on location at the Bent Pyramid. What you'll notice here is that the construction has 2 angles.
Traditional Egyptologists will tell you that the Egyptians were practicing building pyramids, and they started building at one angle, then changed their minds partway through. This is the kind of thinking that paints the ancient Egyptians as infantile and misguided. But is there another way of looking at it?
We call these constructions at that area in Dashur related to king called Senefru.
At Dashur, there are 3 pyramids with 3 burial chambers in each, 9 in total. Traditional Egyptology tells us that the entire site was built by Sneferu. If the established story that the pyramids are tombs is correct, why would Sneferu have needed so many?
Sneferu would have had 9 different possibilities and options for where he would have been buried, which again is illogical. So this comes back to the fact that understanding the Egyptians in terms of traditional Egyptology means that they were misguided and illogical. I don't think this was the case.
Now, when you come to the word Senefru, sin means double. Nefer is harmony, so it's double harmony. It's not a name of a person, but it's the energy we get from these constructions.
Let's consider that the pyramid sites along the Band of Peace are sophisticated harmonic structures. It seems that the chambers in the pyramids were harmonically tuned to different frequencies or musical tones.
The big pyramid, it has 2 chambers for 2 different sounds.
Each chamber in each pyramid, then, could be exemplifying sound technology with distinct tones, creating huge fields of harmonic resonance. At Dashur, we have the Red Pyramid and the Black Pyramid. The Bent Pyramid is covered in white Tura limestone. So we have red, white, and black. Maybe this is a clue to the Giza pyramids also having distinct colors in the past. It would seem that the Great Pyramid would have been shimmering white with its casing stones. The second pyramid still glimmers red. And the third pyramid has the remnants of black stones. This is the old riverbed where the Nile flowed in times past. Here is the Black Pyramid. Egyptologists say the pyramid builders were experimenting and they miscalculated, so the pyramid broke apart. Could there be a different explanation? Another pyramid with similar construction, 100 kilometers south of the Band of Peace, is known as the Maidum Pyramid.
Today, when you walk around Maidum Pyramid, you'll find out that on the ground is a coat of black color flint. And the evidence is this. When you pick up one of these flints, you see it's black at the top and the bottom is a different color. And there is a catastrophe happening over there. I want you to look at the ground. You can see a coat of smoke affect the flints on the ground.
Maidum is not the only place that looks as though there was an explosion. Look at this giant crack in the solid stone of the Red Pyramid. It would have taken a huge force to crack the solid rock. There is a crack in the subterranean chamber in the Great Pyramid. And there is another one in the Grand Gallery. There are weird chemical burns in the Red Pyramid. What could have caused these? Old photos of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid show the stone as black. The room was cleaned and restored, and now we can see the walls are pink granite. The granite sarcophagus has a broken corner, and the wall next to it has a giant crack. The granite sarcophagus has a broken corner, and the wall next to it has a giant crack. What kind of force could have caused this? Is the Department of Antiquities erasing evidence under the guise of restoration? Where did we get the history of Egypt? Herodotus was a Greek historian in the 5th century BC. He wrote from his perspective with help from local people, and we have been repeating it ever since.
It's a fake story. I want you to know yourself, to wake up, to wake the senses and look carefully what you are looking at. What have you seen of the pyramids today? That's what's left of it. Being abused. People quarry stones from there. Anybody can go and pick up stones and to build a church, mosque, house, palace. It's not taken good care of by our Minister of Culture and Antiquities Department. I have to say this.
The story leaves many questions unanswered. Maybe it is time we use the evidence to reconsider what we've been told. We need to look with fresh eyes and use a different time frame to reconstruct the story of ancient Egypt. We are accustomed to our own technology and find it difficult to recognize that the ancients may have had sophisticated technology of their own. Since the technology of the ancients is not obvious to us, are we looking in the wrong place? Could it be they had power systems, but they were entirely different from ours today? Looking at the architecture of structures from ancient Egypt stimulates a sense of wonder. Clearly, Egyptian monuments rival the grandeur of our most modern buildings today. Yet we are taught to believe that we are the ones with knowledge of high technology, something the ancients could not possibly have had.
As long as we think that the ancients weren't able to use high technology, then we're not looking for it. And yet, the evidence is right in front of our eyes.
We find megalithic sites everywhere around the world. So there's certain things in common that they all seem to know, and we don't know it.
Yeah, a lot of people are trying to figure out why mankind built these structures out of these huge megalithic stones. We don't even know how to move 200, 300-ton stones very well today, let alone 4,000 or 5,000 years ago.
It started looking at megalithic structures from an electromagnetic point of view. And sure enough, I began to find that there were these energies there present in measurable forces.
Strange things happen sometimes in sacred sites, and those are clues that the physics that we're taught in school is not everything.
For thousands of years, the pyramids and the Sphinx stood as sentinels on the open desert. Yet, in recent years, a 20-mile wall, 14 feet high, was installed around the enormous site of the Giza Plateau. There are about 100 armed guards patrolling the pyramids at night. Applications for investigative academic research, while entertained initially, are almost all routinely refused. Unlike in times past, tourists are now being restricted from taking photographs in the Egyptian Museum. The monuments of Egypt are World Heritage Sites. Why is access and legitimate scientific research being systematically restricted? Much of ancient Egypt remains undiscovered. Satellite images show traces of buried structures that are still not excavated. In the name of protecting sites, are Egyptian authorities preventing us from learning the truth about our ancient past? Despite strict regulations on what kind of research is allowed, there is still an extraordinary amount of evidence that shows that the ancient Egyptians had knowledge that has been lost.
We don't have the technology to build the pyramids now. Not even close. We're not the most evolved we've ever been. And that is one of the blinders that has stopped us from imagining that the ancients could have been far smarter than us.
Hakim Awian was raised by indigenous elders who lived in the area of the Band of Peace. Having preserved the ancient Suf language, stories were passed down generation after generation. Fragments of knowledge from the ancient past were thus preserved.
If my colleague, the scholar, or learned to say that the Egyptians have a piece of rope put around a block of stone, at least 60-ton weight, and pulled and pushed by animals and run on wooden blocks. This is what the scholars are saying.
We may never be exactly sure how the pyramids were built. Yet we can begin to reconstruct our understanding of the culture living in the Golden Age and their values. Traditional Egyptology insists that the pyramids were built by slaves to feed the egos of kings. Does this fit with our emerging construct of Egypt in a golden age?
There is no slavery. All workers are willingly pyramids builder. This is a qualified people of architecture, engineers, and they deal with all the power like cutting stones, transfer it and use it. And that is clear not only in the pyramids and in the temple walls and many places. You can see that clearly.
There are clues throughout Egypt that point to knowledge of high technology. A fascinating thing occurred when a chunk of stone recently fell off a lintel at Abydos Temple, and controversial images resembling a helicopter and other advanced-looking vehicles were revealed under the stone. It would seem that the images were covered in the distant past when things were changing politically in Egypt. Nowadays, Egyptian tour guides are explicitly instructed not to point these out to tourists. The Egyptological explanation is that it is multiple hieroglyphs overlapping from distant kings' inscriptions. But, like many things in Egypt, the explanation is still debatable. Another controversial object that Egyptologists merely deem impossible is the artifact commonly known as the Baghdad Battery, that generates a mild electrical charge. Similar ancient artifacts that match these objects have been found in Egypt. We can't say for certain, but it would appear that the Egyptians documented the existence of these artifacts as well. Recreations of these objects have been made and have successfully created electric current. Also noteworthy are strange representations of objects that resemble light bulbs, found in the crypts at Dendera. There was no natural light inside these underground crypts, but we see no soot from torches or oil lamps, the only lights we know the ancients used. Could the ancient Egyptians have had their own source of electrical power? If nothing else, the ancients had to cut, move, and lift massive stone blocks that would challenge our engineers today. What was their secret? We automatically assume that ancient structures are for ceremonial and religious purposes. Maybe the pyramids served a completely different function than previously imagined.
There's been lots of speculation about what the pyramids were actually built for. The most accepted notion is that they were tombs.
Much more complicated situation with the Great Pyramid than most people understand or most people believe, including a lot of Egyptologists who see it simply as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu.
That idea is childish for the following reason. I mean, it's obvious, we don't find mummies in the...
And of course, not finding a single mummy in any of the pyramids doesn't seem to deter the people who think that that's what they were for.
Yes, there's something that's sometimes referred to as a stone sarcophagus or coffer in it, a beautiful granite structure, but that doesn't prove definitively in my mind that it was ever actually used for a tomb. It may have been used for many other purposes.
Pyramids were built not as a tomb. There are some pyramids built in a different construction, like the one in Saqqara, State Pyramid, that is tomb.
Look at the obvious difference in construction between the Step Pyramid and the Great Pyramid. The difference in style of construction would logically indicate they were built in different time frames. The buildings we know to be tombs, like the Step Pyramid at Saqqara and the flat-topped mastabas also at Saqqara, are very different from the smooth-sided pyramids at Giza and Dashur. Typically in Egypt, older constructions are built of larger stones. New constructions are built of smaller stones. Also, in archaeology, older structures are deeper. Newer structures are found closer to the surface. Every other tomb that has been found is highly decorated with names of the occupant. The inside of these pyramids seems solely functional and not decorative at all.
But if we stop altogether and say, okay, if they weren't tombs, what were they?
What are the biggest structures that modern man builds on the planet? The biggest, most awe-inspiring structures we create are hydroelectric dams. Why are we willing to invest such awe-inspiring amounts of labor and effort in constructing those? Because we know we're going to get a very valuable physical return in the form of electricity. And by comparison, I wonder if the ancient megalith builders weren't willing to invest such staggering amounts of resources by even smaller populations because they knew that they could get something very physical and worthwhile back from it.
People are fascinated by Egyptian monuments. and some report the energy is palpable at these sites. Is it possible to confirm this energy through scientific means?
What I've been finding the last 20 years of research, a lot of experiments have been done that show that there's a certain type of energy that does not exist in our current science. It's unknown with our current science. We call it subtle energy.
Well, this is a whole new trend of thought in looking at ancient structures, that maybe the ancients understood subtle energies.
So this appears to be a technology that may have existed in megalithic societies. You know, these societies that built things out of big stones.
It makes sense that you could motivate an entire population to invest so heavily in building these structures, I think. And I don't mean to say by any means that this is the only purpose of the megaliths, but I think it's pretty clear that it's at least one of the primary or one of the important purposes for building these structures.
You find megalithic sites everywhere around the world, and there's a tendency to make circles or certain types of formations.
Megalithic sites occur all over the world. Is their placement random, or does the location of these sites reveal yet another hidden layer of ancient knowledge?
One thing I found looking at different megalithic structures over a few continents in numerous places around the world, overwhelmingly these places, the pyramids, the Stonehenges, etc. of the world, were placed on ground where an unusual type of geology naturally concentrates the regular daily natural electromagnetic fluctuations that occur everywhere on the Earth each day.
You go into England, for example, the ley lines that cross England, the Michael line, which is hundreds of miles long, that crosses England, that carries this energy along that line.
It will therefore generate electric currents in the land called telluric currents in the straight geological sense of that word. And those occur everywhere on the planet.
We know that this ley energy, this subtle energy, passes along these lines.
There are certain special types of geology that will magnify those several-fold. And that's where we found the megalith builders preferred to put their monuments.
And typically where lines cross, where you have more than one line intersecting, temples were often built.
These are called conductivity discontinuities, which sounds highly technical, but it's merely the place where one area of ground that has a good ability to conduct electricity meets another area of ground that has a lesser ability to conduct these natural electric currents.
The Chinese had the same tradition. They call them dragon lines. It was illegal for a commoner to be buried on such a line. A king had to be buried on such a line. They put palaces there. There's a whole series of sacred sites that are always built on lines like this.
I want to say in this area about location of temple. You have to have symbols appear on the ground. When it's seen, then this is the place where people naturally come to get more healthy energy from that spot. You know, energy pops from the earth.
And it appears as though they were attempting to control the flow of this energy and use it for their own purposes.
The key hours, unfortunately, are the pre-dawn hours. If you really want to study this, you've got to get up at 3 and get out there very fast. That's because the energy that's involved in these sites, that's really fueling most of it, originates with the daily changes in the Earth's geomagnetic field. It's strongest during the day, weakest at night. And in the hours leading up to dawn, the weaker field lines now come roaring back to closer to full strength very quick. It's the most dramatic time in terms of change of magnetic strength per hour. It's the most dramatic time of the day. And wherever you have a changing magnetic field occurring, you are generating electric current in anything present that will conduct electricity. It's a simple principle of physics known as induction, and it's a universal.
Normally, in everyday life, we don't ever see large concentrations of this energy. Normally, it'll show up at, say, mountaintops, at sacred sites. You'll feel a certain calm, a certain peace. Sometimes people in those places report mystical experiences. They'll see into some other dimension, okay? They'll see into some other time. The Chinese have known about this for a long time, and they call it qi. The Hindus, in their ancient texts, call it prana, and the yogis, that maintain a very ancient tradition, use it. It affects a variety of different processes. Electricity and magnetism has a strong effect on that. So it modifies all the other laws of physics. When you look back on how sacred sites were chosen and buildings like the pyramids were constructed, the suspicion arises that they understood quite a bit more about this stuff than we do, and they may have been using it in their engineering.
Then the megalith builders designed these structures and then built them in such a way as to further concentrate those energies. So they definitely seem to have known what they were doing.
We are not used to things built out of stone being high technology. It is clear that several different kinds of stone from a variety of sources were used to construct Egyptian monuments. Did the distinct qualities of the stones serve a special purpose?
What I do find fascinating is that the core of the pyramids, at least at Giza, are made out of one type of limestone. Now, it is the limestone that was closest, but it also happens to be the type that's called dolomite because it's got a high magnesium content. And the whiter Tura limestone, which, granted, it's whiter and it's prettier and all that, but it also has almost zero magnesium content. And therefore it's a much poorer conductor of electricity. It's closer to a pure calcium carbonate, which is what all limestone is. And pure calcium carbonate conducts electricity much more poorly than dolomite does. It's interesting to me that those outer stones were the ones that they cut so precisely that all these thousands of years later you still can't get a razor blade between them. Because basically what we've got here is we've got a situation with a highly electrically conductive core of those pyramids wrapped in what is effectively a very effective insulator. Why the granite in the passageways, you know? And so, of course, I'm thinking from an electrical point of view and a physical point of view. Is there anything special about granite? And yeah, there is. Granite is slightly radioactive, and it will ionize or electrify the air. Releases radon gas, which is radioactive.
Granite is a transmission stone. It's not dead stone, it's alive.
So you have these sealed shafts with granite linings, and I wonder if it wasn't designed to keep an electrical charge present in those shafts. They were built exactly like, if you will, an insulated wire, only more so because you've got all the charge in the ground that's spread across the base, concentrated all the way up into this tiny spot at the top.
We find similarities in three different constructions. The one at Giza here, Valley Temple, and one at Abydos, and another one abroad in England, the Stonehenge. Same material being constructed with, and same way and same technique. But the construction there, it's built in addition to have the water, because it's water bed. It's a huge water bed, and it's still working, still producing water.
In Egypt, you do have a similar situation to England in that you have limestone aquifers under the monuments.
An aquifer is an underground layer of porous, water-bearing rock. Water flows through the aquifers as rainfall, Or when rivers and lakes flood, the water drains into them.
And movement of water through limestone or chalk aquifers is known to produce electrical charge by two different processes that are self-reinforcing. And I've personally measured this for a week at a stretch at Silbury Hill in England, for example. Before and after thunderstorms, as the water is sinking into the ground, we measured the increase in ground current, the change in the magnetic field as that happened, etc. And in Egypt, you had the Nile crashing, dropping every year and then flooding again. And that movement of water up and down through the layers of limestone would generate electrical charge. Flowing water generates at least a mild electrical charge, which means it generates an electric current, which means it generates a magnetic field as well. So if you were looking to give an electrical charge, a little boost to, say, a mound or something like that, it makes a lot of sense to have it at a minimum running water. And in fact, at Tiwanaku on the south shore of Lake Titicaca, their biggest monument, the Akapana Pyramid, was terraced in such a way as to have the water come down in waterfalls that alternated outside the pyramid, inside the pyramid. But that kind of falling water generates enough electric charge that one of the common school physics experiments is you can, in your own sink at home, if you can divide the stream of water coming out of your faucet into two separate streams, you can take a little LED indicator light and put it between the streams, and it'll generate enough electricity that maybe every 20 seconds or so the light bulb will come on. And then the question is, did some of those layers of limestone run up the Giza Plateau? And they did. And they did, come up to the surface underneath where some of the pyramids are located. The idea would be that it would be the rising and falling of the Nile that would produce this electric ground current by moving through the different layers of the limestone aquifer. And when there was a dip, say, in that supply, maybe that's when the ionized air in the granite shafts and galleries could help keep the process going, if you will. I tend to wonder if the electrified shafts might not have been able to act in a similar fashion to your car battery when you come to a stoplight. Normally, your battery is not being used when you're driving your car. The alternator provides all the juice. But when you stop and that alternator is turning very weakly, that's when you want the battery there to keep everything going so your engine doesn't cut out. So you've got this concentration of negative charge from the ground at the peak of the pyramid or mound, and a concentration of positive charge above it. And if those two become strong enough, you can start to get brush discharge, which would mean it would glow, like ball lightning, for example. It's a theory.
Why in the Great Pyramid is there no frescoes, there's nothing, no decorations at all? Now, some people have proposed the idea that the pyramids are actually energy machines. And so I liken this to the fact, like, you wouldn't put a decoration inside your oven.
I was talking with a woman who had spent some time in the Great Pyramid, and her comment was, it felt like I was in a machine. She said it was not like this, oh, it's a wonderful shrine. She said it felt very functional. In fact, she made a comment that I actually think is probably right on. She said, I felt as if I wouldn't have wanted to be in here when it was running.
Invisible, subtle energy occurs around us all the time and is measurable by science.
We had noticed a lot of people showing us photographs from megalithic sites that disproportionately often seem to have these balls of light in there, usually flash photos.
Orbs are often written off as dust or other particles in the air, but that does not change the fact that they seem to occur more often in particular places at particular times. At
Tikal, at the top of the most energetic pyramid that we found down there, We took a lot of flash photos during the course of our 8-hour stakeouts, which would run from roughly 3 a.m. till 11 a.m. And on the pyramids that were electrically dead, that had no juice, nothing going on, which were the big fancy ones, but the most recently built ones, we would take photos and find out eventually when they were developed, no orbs, no glowing balls of light. But on the oldest pyramid down there, where we did work and got all kinds of results, that was 1,200 years older than the big fancier ones. In that case, the photography we got back from our own simple flash cameras, they were literally choking the screen with these balls at the period at which the air had its highest in electrical charge. And on the strongest day down there, I was recording electrical charge higher than I've recorded even in thunderstorms back home. We don't know what orbs are, but our personal guess is that they're balls of ionized or electrified air that will tend to hang together. A good analogy would be ball lightning, where it's simply so electrified that the molecules are excited enough to glow.
Other evidence shows that there is energy occurring naturally everywhere on the planet that our science knows about but seems to ignore. Nikola Tesla sought to provide the world with free wireless electricity for everybody on Earth. He discovered that electricity occurred naturally throughout the Earth's atmosphere and ground. The telluric currents in the ground that John Burke discussed, and the electricity present in the ionosphere in the atmosphere, which is ionized by the sun. He also created and developed ways to harness those energies.
Tesla, who would teach Nikola Tesla to get to that power of electricity? And he didn't invent it, it's already there, but he know how to use it. And not only that, he did not take an advantage like Mr. Edison.
Tesla wanted to harness the natural energy that exists everywhere on Earth and make it free to the public. Edison endeavored to produce and distribute electricity by creating a regulated monopoly for profit.
He became rich and the people more light into their home. Yeah, so Nikola Tesla, he's the one think of how to use this energy.
Between 1901 and 1917, the Tesla Tower was built on Long Island as a wireless broadcasting system for telephone and electrical signals. Interestingly, it was constructed on an aquifer with descending passageways and tunnels beneath it. At the time, few understood how it worked. Tesla's funding was ultimately dropped by J.P. Morgan because Tesla wanted the wireless electricity to be free, and therefore J.P. Morgan couldn't make a profit. So even though Tesla's genius was seen by many, he was still driven into obscurity. The energy to create free wireless energy has always existed on our planet, and still exists today.
And it's not the only energy on our planet, there are plenty. The rivers are flow by energy, tsunami is energy, frequencies are energy. If we have the electricity now, it's based on explosion energy. Now, the sound energy based on a technology different from the explosion energy, and it's known as implosion energy.
This energy was not the kind of energy that we have that pollutes. It was a completely passive energy that had no byproducts.
The energy we use today is generated by combustion and is non-renewable. It is called explosion energy and leaves exhaust and pollution.
Our system all over the planet today is based on the explosion energy. That's why the petrol is too expensive.
In contrast, implosion energy, like solar panels and wind power, is clean and renewable. we are beginning to realize that we need sustainable energy.
Implosion energy, very simple. All what you need is the beam of the sun on a running water. Not just running in a straight line, but in a zigzag. And that's, you find all the tunnels are in a zigzag form for such a purpose.
In addition to the limestone aquifers underneath the pyramids, there is evidence of a network of man-made tunnels.
As a boy, when I'm living in my house, which is a few hundred yards away from the nose of what we call the Sphinx Tefnuti, this was my playing yard, and I know tunnels. I walked in these tunnels, I swim in these tunnels, I crawl in these tunnels, and I know that this is one way of creating energy. Now this is cost nothing. I mean, all what you need is a beam of the sun reaching the running water underneath the tunnel, and you can see that there are many openers in each tunnel permit this sun beam reach the water. And when it does, then the energy is there. Energy is not just to run your car, or it's run the people, feed the people.
If the pyramid fields of the Band of Peace and the network of underground tunnels are still there, why don't they generate energy the way they used to?
In the condition of the pyramids now, stripped of those smooth insulating outer casings, it's going to leak electrical air about as well as a car radiator radiates heat. I mean, it's almost perfectly designed to weaken that, and yet still you get these reports of people like Siemens, who was one of the pioneers of electricity, and he's an Englishman. There's even a unit of electrical, I believe, resistance named after him called the Siemens. He was on top of the Great Pyramid, I think, during the 1880s, and they began to notice that when his Arab guides stood up and spread his fingers, they'd hear a ringing. And when he closed them, you wouldn't. And he stood up, and he could sense the literal electricity in the air. And on the spot, he improvised an instant Leyden jar, which is one of the earliest things they used to use to store electric charge. And he did it by opening a wine bottle, wetting some newspaper, wrapping the wet newspaper around the glass wine bottle, and holding the wine bottle up above his head until sparks started to issue from the wine bottle. And at that point, his Arab guides started accusing him of things like witchcraft. They got into a physical struggle, and he accidentally touched one of the guides with the charged wine bottle, and it knocked the man to the ground and unconscious for a short period, after which they took off down the pyramid. But there was, in other words, a professional scientist familiar with electricity in its rudimentary but accurate forms, sensing exactly that, even in this ruined condition that the pyramid's in today. Yeah.
If you come to the Egyptian Museum, there is an item over there known as the schist disc, found by Dr. Walter Emery, and he said, or he thinks that it could be a vase for a lotus flower. No.
The schist disc was found at Saqqara in a burial chamber that no one is allowed to visit. Other goods found in the chamber were simple ropes, pottery, and grains. The disc shows clear evidence of sophisticated technology in the way it was built, and it seems out of context with the rest of the grave goods. Is this the original context for this artifact? Or is it possible that it has had a long journey over the last several millennia, and this just happened to be its final resting place? Look at this hollow stone tube. It looks as though the schist disc could fit over it. It would take sophisticated instruments to shape the tube so precisely. How did they do it?
To cut the stone. This is by a sonic cut with no metal instruments like bronze chisel or this. No, it's another stone. And this other stone, it's the hardest stone you can find, which is the diamond.
There are pieces of stone lying around that show concave shapes that actually have the machine tooling marks on it. The evidence of the high technology is right in front of us.
Look again at these quartz objects. Aside from their unique and amazing shapes, could they have had another purpose? Today, quartz crystal is used as the basis of all kinds of modern technology. It is most commonly used in crystal oscillators. Technology uses oscillating frequencies from tiny quartz crystals that vibrate at certain speeds, with a signature vibration for each device. AM/FM radios, CDs and DVDs, computer processors and Ethernet rely on quartz crystals. Could it be that the ancients were tapping into this technology and using it on a much larger scale, in a way we can only begin to imagine? Of course, we can't say for certain, but based on what we've seen, we can theorize. Energy can be created and manipulated in many ways. It is the lifeblood of a civilization, and therefore an important resource.
In Egypt, there are 67 constructions all along the Nile like sails. And for those who has the eye, they can tell from the shape of that construction. The straight form of angles, that is a pyramid or a construction for energy, a plant for energy. That's what we have.
A theory that's always struck me, that they were intended actually to somehow or another spiritualize a whole civilization. In other words, to provide a widespread, high level of energy that people needed because a descending age was upon them.
And I believe what the pyramid and other certain other structures were constructed for was to basically act as a kind of the equivalent of a street light. You know, if you're in a neighborhood that's maybe not the nicest neighborhood, and it gets dark at night, you like to have bright lights go on. And that's effectively what the Great Pyramid was. Now, these were not lights that illuminated it so that people could see where they were going. It was basically a device, a generator for, if you will, broadcasting and transmitting throughout the planetary structure a type of field which uplifted the entire humanity.
And maybe those pyramids were built in some sense or another to stay the decline. Let's call them in some sense or another spiritual granaries designed to somehow store an emotional or spiritual or psychological or some sort of energy that was needed to keep people from becoming the total barbarians that they subsequently became.
We had the ability to basically prop up humanity for a while using the system, but what we saw was the street light eventually went out.
The original knowledge got lost, and the later builders were building them out of ego. They were monuments to the king, if you will, but they were no longer engines that could help feed their people.
Catastrophes around the world damaged, or if you will, decommissioned some of these sites. So some of them went offline, just like a power plant going offline.
I tend to wonder if the few people who knew the secrets to the energy connection with those pyramids didn't die off. If it was a thin chain of, for example, a shaman to his apprentice, and if the wrong people get killed at the right time, that chain is broken, that knowledge gets lost.
As long as we think we are more advanced than we've ever been, we are blind to technology based on subtle energies.
It's not fair also. It's not fair to deny what you can see and touch by your own hand. This is all needed, a technique, and we have that technique still.
but nobody wants to listen.
Why were the ancients so interested in the motion of the stars? Why was cosmology sacred to the ancients? Pondering the history of ancient Egypt, we typically think of the mysteries of the pyramids and the grandeur of the temples. But where did it all start? Do we know how long ago the ancients began tracking the stars? Could there be lost worlds buried beneath the sands? Cosmology is the study of the universe in its totality. We think of cosmology as science, whereas the Egyptians considered it sacred.
There's one thing we know about ancient Egypt for certainty, is that they observed the star Sirius. And we are sure when they speak of that star.
Everything that comes out of the ancient world has to have a spiritual and metaphysical base.
The ancients, and the ancient Egyptians in particular, but probably ancient civilizations more generally, saw themselves, humanity, us, as tied in with the bigger environment, the cosmos, the bigger picture.
They built monuments and they aligned them. But what for? And do their belief systems have validity today?
If we want to decode Egyptian symbolism, we should look for clues in the ancient language that Hakim learned as a child from his elders, living along the Band of Peace. Looking at the many images left by the Egyptians, we have assumed that they were obsessed with death. Turning to the ancient Suf language, however, we learn that they didn't even have a word for death. They called it westing.
We have no word of death in our culture. No word death. And to express this operation of death, we say westing. Going towards west, like the sun rises from the east, and it's westing. So there is no word of death here. We believe in resurrection. If the sun sets in the west, the resurrection happens in the next day when the sun rises in the next day. So the deceased believe that it's just like the sun.
The Egyptians obviously had a very different worldview from ours today. They believed in the afterlife and the soul's immortality.
Was it possible at all that they had found some sort of science of immortality, for example, we call it? As crazy as it may seem, they seem to be very, very convinced that they knew how to send the king to his cosmic world. Those stellar gods, of whom the king believed that he himself would become one stellar god after his death, constructed monuments and performed rituals that mimic the events that they saw in the sky. It sounds against all the tenets of our scientific beliefs, but we have to see why they were so convinced. The ancient Egyptians perceived the land as a cosmic environment, that it followed the activities of the sky because they believed them to be running in parallel. And they had reasons to believe that. One of the main reasons was the cycles of the Nile. The Nile was the lifeblood of Egypt, and it performed a cycle which followed the cycle of the sun and the stars. It's not surprising at all that they associated the reappearance of the stars with the rebirth of the Nile. Essentially, the star religion, if you like, boiled down to one important aspect, that it somehow could help the king become a spiritual being and return to the cosmic world in a specific place with Orion and so forth. How they thought they were going to do it is by looking very, very carefully at what happened to the stars. And the stars perform an annual cycle. But those of Sirius and Orion give us a curious cycle in that they disappear, or they appear to disappear. But if you watch a star over the course of the year, you'll find that there comes a time when it is very low in the west at time of sunset. So the sun sets, and as it gets dark, the star appears just for a few seconds over the west. If you come the next day, you will not see that star. And for 70 days or so, the star has gone. It seems to have gone under the earth. But after those 70 days, it appears by this time at dawn, rising just before the sun, which we call the heliacal rising, whereas the Egyptians call it the rebirth of the star. So in their mind, something happened. In their mind, the star went in the underworld, stayed in the underworld for 70 days, and then by magic popped up again, was reborn again in the east. That's the pyramid text. The pyramid texts mimic this site.
At the ancient site of Saqqara, we find the pyramid texts, the oldest known religious texts in the world. Covering the inner walls of these small pyramids are thousands of hieroglyphs showing knowledge of celestial mechanics and cycles of time. Although we've come a long way in our understanding of hieroglyphs, it is possible that many layers of meaning in the symbols remain hidden. Until now. When we approach hieroglyphics, we do so from our own point of view, and we assume that the letters of our alphabet correspond with certain hieroglyphs. There are 4,000 Egyptian hieroglyphs, but only 26 letters. In order to crack the code, we need to open our minds to different levels of meaning.
I think it's just familiarity with the way modern languages work. No one expects that a word would work differently. Our mindset is that a letter is the carrier of a phonetic value and that a word is the carrier of a concept. To understand the Egyptian words, you have to start from the approach that the letter is the carrier of the concept and the word is an extended sentence. There are nuances of meanings to the words that you don't get if you don't understand what the individual glyphs mean. For instance, there's an Egyptian word that is translated as diving duck, but when you read the glyphs it really reads pool of water, place of diving duck.
In 1822, French scholar Jean-François Champollion and British scientist Thomas Young deciphered the hieroglyphics from the Rosetta Stone. The stone was created in 196 BC. It showed the same text in hieroglyphic, Greek, and Demotic Egyptian on the one tablet. Scholars have used Champollion's translations as the basis for deciphering hieroglyphs. Could Champollion have missed subtleties, or even withheld some information?
One biographical study of Champollion said that he delayed for a very long period of time before producing his translation because, in the words of the study, he clung stubbornly to the idea that an Egyptian glyph might mean something more than just a phonetic value.
Laird Scranton is a computer software engineer who has interpreted a new aspect of hieroglyphics.
Basically, Egyptian hieroglyphic words work more like an acronym in English, like the phrase FYI or an acronym such as CIA or CBS, where anyone who reads English understands that you don't try to pronounce this word. This is not a word that you're going to read for its meaning in terms of the letters all put together. It's one letter at a time stands for one word at a time, and you put the words together to get the meaning.
If we think of each hieroglyphic word as an acronym rather than having a phonetic value, a new layer of interpretation appears. Hieroglyphs reveal in symbolic terms the way the ancient Egyptians thought the universe works.
I can show that certain key glyph shapes came out of cosmology, which describes how the universe was created. Okay, and because the shapes came out of cosmology, it makes sense that the meanings that attach to the shape are associated with cosmology also. They would have meanings related to the creation of the universe. Once you agree that the sun glyph means what it means, and that's all traditional meanings, it's hard to argue that the word month doesn't say the moon makes an orbit. Or it's hard to argue that the word year doesn't say time of the Earth's orbit around the sun.
The ancient Egyptians were almost obsessive keepers of records. And one thing that they observed most was the celestial objects. We'd expect them to pay attention and record. Now, how far back? That's a big question. Well, we now have some sites that go at least 6,000 to 7,000 years before. There's a megalithic site that has been found in the early 70s, but not understood until lately, that has astronomical alignments. And strangely, the astronomical alignments that it has are precisely the ones you find in the Pyramid Age. So Orion, Sirius, the summer solstice, they're all there. It's no more theory. We have evidence that they did it.
For decades, author Robert Bauval has been studying the alignment of Egyptian monuments to key stars.
Mohammed, shukran. We've come here, and what we're trying to do is get to the Nabta. The most important thing is we get there. Yeah.
He is now planning an expedition across the desert to a site called Nabta Playa, 100 kilometers west of the Nile and 30 kilometers north of the Sudanese border. It is the location of Egypt's oldest astronomical measuring device.
And when we're there, how do you know we're there? It's all desert.
Yes, it's desert. Every place here in Western Desert, I know it.
If you can, we're going to need a GPS.
Yeah.
If you can get one.
Yes, I have one.
That makes me feel a lot happier.
The team finds out that permits from Cairo have been delayed.
Now we wait. You tell us we wait for the answer from Cairo. And so in the meanwhile, let's go and see the sites. Let's go and see some of the temples here. Yeah? Okay. Let's do it.
The key to decoding Egypt is in the alignments of the temples, which changed in different epochs to match the majestic drift of the procession of the stars.
We're now here at the Karnak temple in Luxor. On this wall we can see the ritual of the stretching of the cord. On the right-hand side is the goddess Seshat, represented by a priestess. She's holding a rod and a mallet. And on the other side is the pharaoh. There's a cord looping between them, and what they're doing is that they're aligning the monument to the stars.
We know from inscriptions at the Temple of Karnak that they aligned monuments with the circumpolar stars, principally the Big Dipper.
They also align to the stars of Orion, very similarly to what we also have at Nabta. The Karnak temple, the very center of Egyptian religious activity, is aligned to the sunrise at the winter solstice. So as we look down the axis this way, on the winter solstice the sun will rise along the axis. And in the summer solstice, it will be aligned to the sunset of the sun. So as we have at the Nabta Playa, in the circle
of the calendrical circle where there is the summer solstice alignment. Here we have another example of the similar alignment 3,000 years later.
On the expedition into the open desert, Robert Bauval hopes to see for himself that these alignments exist in the remote region of Nabta Playa. The team prepares by mapping a route they will access via GPS. Jeeps are equipped with supplies for the dangerous journey. The team arrives at the first stop on their journey through history. In the heart of the El Khaga oasis lies a Christian settlement dating back to the 3rd century AD. Original paint graces the ceiling of the chapel, telling the stories of Adam and Eve.
What is important here is that at Nabta we have a settlement that is 6,000 BC at least. And here we have a settlement, a Roman settlement, which is of the 1st, 2nd century. Surely the people here were aware of some sort of origins in the desert. They must have moved around here. They're only 300 kilometers away. And this is the big work that anthropologists have to get into, cultural anthropologists, people who understand how to look for clues within a lost culture. We're looking for a lost culture that could be the origins of our civilization. That's what we're talking about here.
Off in the distance, the Christian settlement can be seen. In the valley below, we can see the old riverbed of the Nile, which has migrated over 60 kilometers to the east. How many thousands of years would it take to wind back the geological time clock to when the Nile flowed here?
The Nile we know there was here. Before we didn't know. You realize what this is? Almost surely the ideas of these people, their beliefs, the way they look at the stars, the way they look at the sun, the way they buried people, comes from here to influence the pharaonic civilization. Imagine 2,000 years ago. There was a Roman garrison with centurions walking about, and priests, and Roman ladies in carriages. I mean, it's amazing to think that this was like this. People have been here for thousands of years. I mean, we know that. But now you're going to show us caves, you're going to show us prehistoric caves, where there are drawings that tell us that people were here even longer than we thought. Maybe 10, maybe 15,000 years ago. And that's incredible. Now we're on a 30, 40 meter high dune, right in the middle of the path of the road. The old road, as you can see, I mean, it's quite amazing. The old road actually strikes a dune. This is a new dune. It's been formed, well, in the last 30 years or so. It shows you how the sand moves fast.
The team tests the jeeps in the open desert by heading off to an ancient desert monastery. Along the way, the team stumbles across a large outcropping of stone with obvious layers of stratification. The guide tells the team that the area is an ancient ocean bed. There's water like ripples, and seashells are still embedded in the hard rock, indicating a vast change in geology and climate over the past several thousand years.
It's probably petrified timber, this on a much later period, but you can see the shells here. The shell is encrusted. They're millions of years old. We're walking on terrain that is millions of years old.
The western desert today is rainless, but in the past it received as much as 500 millimeters of precipitation per year. There were permanent lakes, large springs, and seasonal streams. The most recent wet period was between 130,000 and 70,000 years ago. Then it was thornbrush, savanna. At that time, the area supported many large animals, gazelles, giraffes, buffalo, camels, and antelopes. After that period, it was hyper-arid until 12 or 13,000 BC. Before 12,000 years ago, the summer tropical monsoons reached southern Egypt. Precipitation was limited and fell mostly during the summer months. It was sufficient to support small animals and cattle. The small animals could live off the dew. The climate resulted in highly mobile human populations. There are ancient cave paintings in a remote location that may provide clues to human settlements from the distant past. Is this crucial evidence being protected by Egyptian authorities?
It's terrible. Terrible. It's priceless. Priceless prehistoric evidence. Look here. Look here. What's this, a dog or a gazelle? A man. You see the man here? He's wearing pharaonic clothes. It's terrible. With scribbles all over. I mean, the evidence that we're looking for is being destroyed by irresponsible people coming here. The site is unprotected, and the irony is that people who are responsible are prevented from coming here and driven crazy with licenses and papers. Look here. Oh, there's a beautiful Hatorian cow. Look at this. I mean, this is an artist. This is not a primitive carver.
Pre-dynastic Egyptian belief systems originated with cattle cults linked to the Nile. A cow was seen as the mother of the sun. Cattle were deified and were considered earthly representatives of the gods. An enduring ideology with Hathor as the center figure. Images of bulls were shown with depictions of stars, and this dates to before pre-dynastic Egypt. Cattle pastoralists were in the Sahara several thousand years before pre-dynastic Egypt. Gilf Kabir, which means large plateau, is another large ceremonial center a further 600 kilometers west, near the borders of Libya, the Sudan, and Egypt. The Cave of the Swimmers, made famous by the movie The English Patient, is located here. Prehistoric rock art shows people and their cattle. Since Gilf Kabir is 600 kilometers away, it seems as though cattle cults were prevalent throughout North Africa in ancient times. Could this be another clue that the nomadic tribes were connected? Could they have influenced the ancient Egyptians? Arriving at the monastery, we can see it has never been accessible by road. Once occupied by Christians, it lies upon an ancient camel trail 40 days from its closest neighboring site. It still shows evidence of having been an oasis, with a huge acacia tree that is more than 800 years old. The team has a picnic on a carpet of yellow acacia flowers.
This is a wonderful oasis. I mean, I'm really pleased. We tested the cars, everything's working fine. You know, the drivers are fine. And it was a good idea to come and rest here. I needed the rest because after all these tense of waiting for the permits, everything is ready, the permits are ready.
Yeah, but you must be to living now this place to go to the hotel and stay overnight, and we start tomorrow up early at 3 a.m. morning.
I'm ready.
Yes, I know you're ready, but you don't know. It's a hard way to arrive to Abu Simbel.
Let's do it. Let's do it. We wait a long time. Let's do it. Let's have a good night's sleep.
The team gets an early start, armed with long-awaited permits granted by the Supreme Council of Antiquities and the Egyptian army. They will enter the dangerous region of the Western Desert to the south of El Khaga Oasis.
Well, after days of waiting and of uncertainty, we're finally on the road. We've got the permit, and we're ready to go out in the desert to Nabta.
انت نفك الثانيه وليد يعني مصاريف زيادة.
After driving south for hours along an old road covered by occasional sand dunes, there is nervousness in the air. The team will be traveling blind in the open desert for the last part of the journey, relying solely on GPS equipment to locate the ancient site of Nabta Playa.
Yeah, about
this is very good. This is very tough.
3 kilometers.
No.
I'm sure.
What clues will be uncovered at Nabta Playa? How have these influences drifted across the African continent? More than 3,000 kilometers further west, in Mali, there is a living culture with a surprisingly similar worldview to that of the ancient Egyptians. The Dogon live in Mali, largely in isolation. Studies of the Dogon culture mirror the ideology of the ancient Egyptians with uncanny precision.
I realized through my Dogon studies that there were relationships between Dogon words and Egyptian words, and I noticed that Dogon drawings turned up as glyphs in those Egyptian words.
Laird Scranton's radical reinterpretation of Egyptian hieroglyphs came directly from his studies of Dogon cosmological symbols. Their priests use cosmological drawings, symbols they have used for thousands of years. While it is impossible to ask the ancient Egyptians to explain their beliefs, Dogon priests can explain their cosmology and how their symbols are written and pronounced.
The Dogon lay things out in such detail that it's like having the teacher's copy of the manual of the book, you know, you're studying, with the answers to the questions written down in the back. You can go to a Dogon priest, or you can go to the anthropological studies that were taken in relation to the Dogon priests, and they flat out tell you what their symbol means and what they're, what they're trying to talk about. The general pattern I could say is that Dogon cosmology tells us how a concept should be expressed, how the word should be pronounced, what multiple levels of meaning the word should be associated with, and what kind of a drawing it should be associated with. That predicts for us what we ought to find in Egypt. And so when I go to Egyptian studies, I look at the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary or go to a book about Egyptian cosmology, sure enough, I find the same word expressing the same meanings, written with the same drawing or the same drawn character, and I say I've got a match.
How is it possible that the Dogon culture in present-day Mali is connected to the ancient Egyptians? What is the link?
The Dogon seem to have come out of a class of priests who had very specialized knowledge and who, for one reason or another, were not happy with the way things were going in Egypt and deliberately left. I would say that sounds like it's true. I can't prove it's true, but it doesn't contradict anything I know. The fact that there's a match between the Dogon drawing and the Egyptian glyph in the context of the same word, pronounced the same way, with carrying the same meanings, is just another level of validation that I'm on the right track, that these words really do correspond to each other.
Using this new interpretation of hieroglyphic, what can we learn about the ancient Egyptian view of sacred cosmology?
I had some concerns originally as I began writing some of the books about what right did I have to be revealing secrets that have been kept for 3,000 years. But when I realized that the cosmology is about science, it's about the creation of matter and things like that, and I realized how close our science is right now to being caught up with what the cosmology, the ancient cosmology, seemed to know, I realized that if anybody's going to get any benefit out of it at all, that it has to come out now. You can't wait any longer. We're only about 50 years away from discovering all the things that I found in the Dogon and Egyptian cosmology.
Is it possible the ancient Egyptian cosmology was more advanced than today's science?
I'd say there is information in the ancient cosmology that would be a benefit to the string theorists and to the modern cosmologists if they'd pay attention to it. I think the Dogon and the Egyptians explain to us how it is that a mere act of perception can cause the wave-like behavior of matter to turn into particles, which the scientists don't know. When you ask Stephen Hawking how many fundamental particles there are, he says more than 200. If you ask a Dogon priest, he says 266.
Science is on the verge of understanding things that ancient civilizations seemed to know long ago. How is this possible?
Very, very close. Within a couple of 100 meters.
The excitement builds for the real destination of the expedition, the ancient site of Nabta Playa.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Here we have this bunch of huge megaliths that were dragged from God knows where and placed in a pattern, a sort of center point of the whole area. It's essential that we do not disturb the stones, we don't touch anything, we just look at them. Because the alignments are there and they've been there for thousands of years, undisturbed, and we can use them to date this place.
A group of archaeologists led by Fred Wendorf, called the Combined Prehistoric Expedition, by chance found some pottery shards at Nabta Playa. They thought that the megaliths were just outcrops of rock, And then they started to realize, well, these are setting on top of playa sediments, sediments that were built up during the Neolithic time. And so how did they get there? And so they had to get there from man. These are man-made objects, these megaliths. One of the possible links to Egypt before the pharaohs is that Nabta Playa became climatically hyper-arid like it is today around 3800 BC. It has not been lived at or used since.
It has been assumed by historians that Egypt borrowed its complex society from Mesopotamia. However, it is now generally recognized that a process of social complexity is not diffused from one location to another, but rather develops locally.
(3400 BC is when you see pre-dynastic cultures building up on the Nile Valley, just 100 kilometers east of Nabta Playa. If that's the case, then a lot of the great dynastic Egyptian stuff we're all familiar with had some aspect of origin in the Nabta Playa people's cultural development.
Dr. Nicole Dweck is an Egyptologist who lectures at the British Museum and at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. By strange coincidence, she happened to be at Nabta Playa on the same day as our team.
From what I understand from her, she also believes that this could be the source of Egyptian civilization.
This is just amazing. I've wanted to come here since the first publications came out.
What are the odds of meeting on the same day?
None.
Okay.
The coincidences for me are astonishing. I mean, last year, the same people, we went to Gilf Kebir and Wenat. We spent 2 days roaming around Karkotal and looking at the graffiti and, all the bovids and the cattle and the people moving around with their animals. And it's the same dates as here.
These people had what today we would call a calendar. They used the position of the sun to mark the specific days of the year, and the main stations of the year, of course, are the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and the 2 equinoxes. No doubt, they tracked the sun through the year, and therefore they had a calendar.
This structure may not appear significant above ground. Looking beneath the surface reveals an enigma.
These complex structures are the most enigmatic remaining aspects of Nabta Playa. When they excavated the central one, the largest one, underneath the surface, down in the playa sediments, the playa sediments were about 10 feet deep. They found this megalithic sculpture. Some people call it the cow stone. It has perhaps a vague resemblance to a cow, but it also seems maybe to have an astronomical meaning because it's in this astronomical complex. And then underneath the sculpted stone, on the bedrock, underneath all the sediments that were laid down earlier, they found another sculpture, sculpted out of the living bedrock, and sort of like the Sphinx is sculpted out of the bedrock.
The bedrock sculpture was carved, and sediment filled it in over thousands of years. Then the cow stone was carved and placed there, and then sediment filled it in again. We are looking at 3 subsurface layers of sediment. This is a clue to the extreme age of Nabta Playa.
What makes all this far more exciting is that they also align to stars. And that's a totally different ball game here, because aligning to stars means that they track the seasons. The climatic conditions were very important to them. There was the beginning of the monsoons, and therefore the stars would be the signal to them that the monsoons had started. They would start migrating here, and they would arrive here when the water, the monsoons, the rainfalls had filled the lakes. It was essential that they get here when the lakes have water. It would have been a fatal mistake had they come here 20 or 30 days before the event. The complex radiates 3 series of lines, east, and a series of lines north. Right. According to Wendorf and the checkups by Brophy, we've got alignments to the rising of certain stars here and here.
A double alignment of blocks, 250 meters long, points to the brightest stars in the belt of Orion. The second line points to the rising position of Sirius. Another long line of stones aligns to the brightest star of the Big Dipper, which later Egyptians represented as a cow thigh or leg. The stelae face the circumpolar region of the heavens, which the pyramid text describe as a place where the stars never die.
They've got Orion's belt and Sirius. What's interesting is that they seem to be tracking them, not just a line in two, but they seem to be tracking them over the movement over a long period of time.
So they knew the stars moved, and they knew that the sun moved the same every year on an annual cycle. Maybe the whole ceremonial complex has something to do with the age of Gemini and transition to the age of Taurus.
The constellation of Taurus is represented by a bull. If we are talking about the transition to the age of Taurus, was the symbolism of cows in ancient Egypt connected to the nomadic cattle cults prevalent in the area?
So astronomy is telling us that there's a link. Now we need the anthropologists and the Egyptologists to find that link.
The problem is that most of these disciplines are so entrenched in their own little world that it's very difficult to move people one side or the other. And I mean, I don't know how it is in the United States, but in Britain, everyone is in his own little world, and people who deal with text won't talk to people who deal with sites in the same discipline.
It's becoming more than obvious now.
I think it is.
That there are
connections.
Connections.
Of course there are. And they're very, very important connections, because there are no other answers, for the moment anyway. And this is as good as any.
Yeah.
Better.
The sheer beauty and sophistication of Egyptian artifacts entrances us. How can we unlock the code embedded in every object they made? How does the symbolism in Egyptian art illuminate their cultural values? What ancient secrets still lie hidden in plain sight? Our understanding of ancient Egyptian culture is limited. Looking at the artifacts left behind by the ancients, it is obvious that they had different values, customs, and beliefs from ours today. History books are filled with stories of war, invasion of territories, and patriarchal ways of being and thinking. Yet it seems that ancient Egypt enjoyed long periods of peace and prosperity, and a profound connection with nature and spirit. Is there a way to understand the shift?
So what we refer to as history that began some 6,000 years ago is really the advent of a different style of social organization that's typified by hierarchies of dominance, warring deities, warring mythologies, and control systems.
Vedic culture from ancient India speaks of a grand and measurable cycle of 26,000 years, consisting of ascending light ages and descending dark ages.
In the higher ages, you see this philosophy of living in tune with nature. People talk about speaking with the gods and a lot of interaction. Virtually every ancient culture has stories about the gods if you go back far enough. And you see a lot of matriarchal cultures if you go back far enough. The Dark Age times, you have this very brutal, paternalistic type of ruling.
I think it's difficult for us to understand the ancient Egyptians because we've got the paradigm of the patriarchal structures on top of it, and we're looking through our own cultural lenses.
Has world culture always been male-dominated and patriarchal? If not, what would a matriarchal system look like? Matriarchy is not the opposite of patriarchy, with women dominating and controlling men. It is based on balance between the masculine and feminine, and harmony with nature. This was exemplified in ancient Egypt, which was known in the old language as the land of Kemet. Hakim Awiyan received teachings about the Comitian people in the distant past.
The ancient life system in Egypt here. The Comitian tradition being passed down through the mother. Mother is the teacher, not the father like patriarchy system. This is matriarchy. She is the goddess. She is everything in the house.
Based on the countless artifacts that show the high status of the feminine, it seems that women had the same status as men, if not a higher status.
In the museum, you have statues. You notice that the woman put the arm around the man's shoulder. And that shows, are they equal? No. Woman was the upper head in the family. When she put her arm around the man's shoulder, she's saying, this is mine. You also see that the sculpture in the old days put the feminine wig on a man's head when he promoted more to a woman than a man.
Men's wigs were layered in different lengths, like steps. Women's wigs were parted in the middle, smooth, and all one length. When a man wore a woman's wig, it was an indication that he had high status.
Only men with wisdom who wear the women wig. So these are the scribes and the physicians and the rest of them.
All you can do is go back into the old kingdom, and what you find is, is obviously a fair amount of equality. The goddesses are revered as reverently as the gods, and there's even the instance, for example, of Hathor, the exception, in that she's the only deity that has a temple column all to herself. So the great mother, the great feminine principle, occupies a very important part in the whole Egyptian symbology, the whole Egyptian doctrine. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Women could own property at as much rights as the men. They could divorce as easily as the men. Of all the known sophisticated civilizations that we have access to, probably women were better off in Egypt than they were anywhere else.
Perhaps we are looking at ancient Egypt from a patriarchal viewpoint. We should let the symbolism in the artifacts tell their own story. The frescoes we see lining temple walls in Egypt and on stone slabs in museums around the world each tell their own story. We see the same images repeated again and again in Egyptian art. By learning to decode these symbols, we can look back in time, peeling back the layers of patriarchy that cloud our understanding of ancient history. Then we can begin to decipher the messages that the ancients left us.
You have to accept that we're dealing with a period that occurred at least 5,000 years ago. And the little we know of it comes from archaic texts that were written in a very occult and esoteric manner. They weren't meant for you and me.
The secrets of the ancient Egyptians were not for the commoners.
They were meant for a very, very small group of elites who had to be initiated over many, many years to appreciate what these texts said.
They were for the high-level initiates, which were people who were trained and they would go through different initiations, tests that would help them be wise, that would help them confront their fears, that would balance them in the body, mind, and emotions.
Initiates were students who were given rudimentary instruction on the mystery traditions of Mayan and Egyptian cosmic cycles.
As they approached higher levels of consciousness, they came to respect different aspects of themselves that were represented in the feminine and the masculine. But they went further and called it sacred feminine and sacred masculine, which meant the purest form that was actually connected to the two hemispheres of the brain.
Feminine consciousness corresponds to the right hemisphere of the brain and the left side of the body. In contrast, masculine consciousness corresponds to the left side of the brain and the right side of the body. Patriarchal consciousness focuses on history, linear time, dogma, rationality, waking reality, and science. Matriarchal consciousness focuses on eternity, cycles of time, ritual, magic, altered states, and art. If we examine the art, we can see the characters almost always have one foot slightly forward. In some instances, they take a big step forward. In each scene, the goddess has her left foot slightly. The pharaoh, however, takes a large step with his right foot. This shows that he is grounded in the masculine. Similarly, we often see images with two left hands. It has been suggested that this is just a stylistic convention, but we should not impose our ideas on Egyptian art. Left hands suggest giving, while right hands suggest taking.
In our culture, we've practically erased the feminine in favor of the masculine. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Art, music isn't as important. And our society is completely unbalanced because of it. The ancients knew that you could not achieve high states of consciousness without these being in balance. And so they revered the pure qualities of either. And so when we say sacred feminine and sacred masculine, this was the highest form of respect, so that the female would have both feminine and masculine balanced within her, and the male would have both feminine and masculine balanced within him.
Balance between the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine runs deep in Egyptian symbolism. We see gods and goddesses carrying a crook, a flail, and a staff in various combinations. The crook represents the balance of the emotions. The flail symbolizes the balance of the mind, and the staff depicts the balance of the body. Once balance of the body, the mind, and the emotions was achieved, consciousness could develop. Notice the staff always has the head of a bird and a forked base. The staff never touches the ground. This indicates that we are spiritual beings having an earth experience. We are incarnated here, but our souls can go beyond the earthly plane. Egyptian temples were places where spiritual work was done. An arch with a winged disc is always found at the entrance to temples. The winged disc depicts a vulture and a snake.
Snake being taken as a symbol of masculine, and the vulture is feminine.
The feminine and the masculine had to be in balance. The lower self was to surrender to the higher self in order to enter the sacred space. This meant that the ego of the everyday world had to step aside, while the higher self connected with cosmic energy.
Vulture can fly, snake can't fly, but both have the same glands. System of
life is based on glands.
The glands were the most important features of the human being.
One of the most misunderstood functions of the human body today is our glandular or endocrine system. Glands secrete hormones that trigger reproduction. Fertility and procreation had high value in Egyptian ideology.
The ancients were very much in tune with how the energy systems in the body, or the chakras, as the East Indians would talk about them, were connected to the glands.
Ancient teachings speak of 7 energy centers in the body called chakras. Parallels occur between the concepts of chakras, or energy centers in the body, and our glands. It appears they are 2 ways of describing the same thing, through spirituality and through science. Ancient Egyptians had a holistic understanding of the significance of the glands and their central role in reproduction and in consciousness. If we can decode the symbols, we see that the sacredness of procreation is readily visible in ancient Egyptian art.
When you see a boy or a man, you see a kind of a bottle on his head. That is not a bottle or not a white crown symbolizing Upper Egypt, as my colleagues and the scholars say. No, this is a gland in the human body known as the thymus, located behind the lungs.
The thymus is most active when a baby is in utero. It continues to be active until puberty. Then it begins to shrink and is atrophied when we stop being fertile. It was a critical activator of consciousness.
The red crown is another. It's the womb, the placenta. The thymus and the womb are connected for the cycle of life. When you see the double crown, the red crown is the womb and the placenta. The white crown is the thymus, who has its influence on the womb. That's the symbol of one of the glands.
In the early 1900s, alchemist Schwoller de Lubitz presented a work called The Temple of Man. It demonstrated that the architects of the Luxor temple used sacred geometry, which reflected the exact proportions of the human body. As in all Egyptian temples, the most sacred space was located at the back of the temple, the Holy of Holies, which corresponded to the pineal gland. When activated, the pineal gland is said to stimulate the evolution of higher states of consciousness. If the temples were metaphors of the human body, the pineal gland corresponded with the Holy of Holies. At the entrance to the most sacred part of the temple stand tall pillars representing the masculine and the feminine, papyrus and the blue lotus. The papyrus and the lotus reflect the balance between the feminine and the masculine principles and are shown together throughout ancient Egyptian art.
The blue lotus is a symbol of life, and this plant, blossom, flower, it grows in the water like water lilies. It's where the ancient Commissions believe that life starts in water and in that lotus form.
We have seen there are always multiple layers of meaning embedded in ancient Egyptian symbols. Is there another reason why the blue lotus was so important in Egyptian ceremonies? In ancient Egyptian art, we see countless instances of part animal, part human forms. What were the ancients trying to convey by these curious images?
There's a technical term for such creatures that anthropologists use. They call them therianthropes, and that's from the Greek therion, which means wild beast, and anthropos, which means man. They're combinations of beast and man. It's not an accident that all of the gods of Egypt are therianthropic. They have, of course, fully human forms, but in most cases they also have forms that are part animal and part human. So you may consider Horus the head of a hawk and the body of a man. You may consider Sekhmet a lioness with a human body and a lion's head. Or Anubis, of course, the guide of souls, who is part jackal and part human.
Egypt isn't the only place where these half-animal, half-human images have been found. Half a world away, we find clues to decode these mysterious symbols.
Throughout the Amazon today, shamans working with the powerful visionary brew ayahuasca, a combination of two plants. Very frequently they will, after their visions, when they return to the normal, alert, problem-solving state of consciousness, they will actually sit down and, recollecting what they saw in the visionary state, will paint and draw the images that they saw. And the most common motif of these ayahuasca visions is the therianthrope, creatures that are part animal and part human in form. This specific characteristic of the ancient Egyptian gods is one of the things that tells me that our ancient Egyptian ancestors were using altered states of consciousness to explore the realms of spirit.
Again, we see images of blue lotuses. Is there another, less obvious interpretation of this symbol?
Altering of consciousness has been done by a variety of different methods and techniques, most commonly in shamanistic cultures. Still to this day, it's done by using hallucinogenic plants, which, as it were, switch the receiver wavelength of the brain and allow us to tune in to other realities. Of course, there are a range of non-drug techniques, rhythmic dancing, certain kinds of music, certain kinds of spaces have an effect on human consciousness. But there's a great deal of evidence that they made use of a potion involving the blue lotus and the mandrake root, possibly also the opium poppy as well, to enter a visionary state, and in that visionary state to explore, navigate, and learn about the realm that lies beyond death. And they had very concrete and specific ideas about this, which are expressed in the ancient Egyptian books of the dead, going right back to the pyramid texts. This was not a work of imagination on the part of the priests. This was a work of documentation, of their out-of-body exploration of realms that lie beyond the merely physical.
Is it possible for us to learn to access other realms today? Can we expand our capacity to perceive? Do we need new ways to describe these phenomena?
If I come today and say, I saw you in my dream, you're going to ask me, what did you see? Then I say the dream. Now, did I show you? The verb see is not there, because I did see you in my dream, but not with my eyes, because I was asleep. So how did that happen? There must be a sense put all this vision to me without my eyes. But I still, when I speak, limit vocabularities to say, I saw you in my dream. No, I didn't see you. But there's no other way to say it.
Could the ancients have mastered innate human abilities that we have forgotten?
You can't tell if that bird on the tree is happy or frightened from a cat. Yeah? You can't tell that the donkey is annoyed or happy by the vibration of the sound. And that's what we want us to notice, the sound. It's not the word you said, it's how being said. You can tell if this vibration, the truth or not truth. It's natural. Healthy people, they use all the senses, the full capacity of senses.
The five senses, as we know them today, were symbolized by the scarab.
And when you see, the scarab, you are looking at a human skull, divided in three sides, three sections. The front head, symbolized by ancient people as seven openers. 2, 4, 6, 7. That is the front head. And these are the receivers. You see with, you hear with, you taste with, you know, everything. On the left side is the consciousness side, and that is the daily deeds digested every moment you look at things. But the other side is the subconscious side, something you are unable to explain what's going on.
It seems clear that the ancients knew about the subconscious mind. They had the power to reach beyond the senses, something we began to be aware of with the writings of Freud and the advent of psychology in the early 1900s.
Don't compare people of today like the people of the ancient days. The people of ancient days were healthy. They able to use the senses. We looking at things as a crippled people. We only have 5 senses. We're supposed to have 360 senses. 360, and only 5 is recognized. We got the glands of the sense, but we didn't use it. And any muscles you don't use, it shrinks. Obviously.
How can we begin to imagine that the ancients had the capacity of 360 senses? Perhaps a metaphor for the full spectrum senses could be a sphere. Is it possible for us to move beyond our 5 senses today?
Our 5 familiar senses have been evolved by evolution to connect us to the physical and material realm. But we have, I like to think of it as a secret doorway inside our own minds, which can be opened in altered states of consciousness, through which we may project our consciousness into other realms and dimensions, and those then become accessible to us.
Could it be that the ancient Egyptians were accessing supernatural realms through heightened perceptions that came from full spectrum senses?
I've come to the conclusion that it's really impossible to understand ancient Egyptian civilization and ancient Egyptian spirituality and religion until you get to grips with the fact that the priests of that religion were deliberately and in a targeted way cultivating altered states of consciousness in order to access the supernatural realm. They know what shamans all over the world still know today, that in the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness that is particularly valued by Western industrial society, you are not going to have supernatural or spiritual experiences of any kind. It doesn't mean that the supernatural and spirit realms are not there, because they are. They are all around us all the time. But our senses cannot tune into that.
It seems that the ancients must have been tuned into something that allowed them to build sacred structures using monumental architecture. Today, we consider ourselves to be highly educated, yet engineers are at a loss when they try to build even a small pyramid. Has our system of education diverted us from what was common knowledge in ancient times?
There were no schools and universities like what we have today. We've been influenced by this system of teaching. Today we think it's a relative life, that no education, they haven't been to school, and how can they build a pyramid? They don't know figures, how can they do this? But we don't know that the senses we have make the impossible possible. The impossible to us, which based on ignorance, make it possible. Because knowing
is a very great power, just to know.
The most important ceremony for teaching the populace how to live well was the weighing of the heart. It reveals what the ancients believed happened in the moments after death.
Initially, in the ceremony of the weighing of the hearts, the deceased would meet Anubis, who would say, "You're dead. Let's have your heart. We're going to weigh it against the feather of truth." If your heart was heavy, because you had done something immoral, you weren't allowed to go to the other side. So the populace learned that they had to be light of heart in order to live well.
As ancient Egypt slipped into patriarchal ways of being and thinking, the old spiritual ideology became codified, and organized religion became dominated by the Amun priesthood.
The Amun priesthood had a lot of power, and they were in a position to have people pay for their salvation. It used to be that your heart was weighed against a feather of truth, but in later pictures of the ceremony of the weighing of the heart, you'll see Horus holding onto the scale, and you could pay the priesthood for Shakti dolls, and the more of them you had, the more likelihood you could buy the lightness of heart instead of being. Well, this is a fundamental change in terms of how to live well. And I think that we still are living in that way.
History is written by its victors, and as the patriarchy took hold, much effort was put into suppressing Egypt's matriarchal past.
There's a few pharaohs who were erased from the king's list. Hatshepsut was one, Akhenaten was one, and Tutankhamun was another.
The legacy of the controversial pharaoh, Akhenaten, was almost lost forever with the complete destruction of the city he and Nefertiti had founded at Amarna.
Now, very little was known about Amarna until there was an earthquake, and the pylons at Karnak were filled with these little blocks that had been cut up, and they used them from Amarna to just as filler inside the pylons. So when archaeologists found them and started putting them back together, they realized there was a very large story here.
For the ancients, life on Earth mirrored the motion of the stars in the sky.
What the ancients did is they would have the capital be at Heliopolis in the north for 2,160 years, and then they would have the capital be at Thebes, which is now Karnak, for that length of time. When Akhenaten came into power in the new kingdom of the 18th dynasty, it was right at the time when things were supposed to shift.
During this time, the patriarchy gained momentum, with the Amun priesthood steadily becoming more powerful.
Akhenaten happened to have been born at one of these points of return, or beginning. He believed that he was subjugated, like all pharaohs, to a cosmic law, to the law of math. What happens up there, they believed, was controlling matters on earth. And things happened up there that dictated to Akhenaten that he had to move his base and had to reinstall the original religion.
When it came time for Nefertiti and Akhenaten to change the capital, they knew that the Amun priesthood was in power and that they would really fight them on this.
If he had moved to Heliopolis, there would have been civil war. If he had stayed in Karnak, he would have not performed what he had to perform to follow the law, the cosmic law. Finally, he settles for a midpoint.
So instead of moving the capital back north, they decided to take a point exactly in the middle between the two, and this was Amarna.
Art created by artisans in the Amarna period is exquisite and markedly different from the art in other periods. For the first time, Egyptian royal art depicted the pharaoh and his family all together and clearly showing affection for each other.
They built this wonderful place, and they had gorgeous palaces, and people were creative. It was peaceful, there were flowers and nature, and people lived a leisurely life. But what it was a return to true spirituality. He ruled with his co-regent, Nefertiti. The feminine was honored.
In this transition, Akhenaten and Nefertiti rejected the established religion of the corrupt Amun priesthood. They had a profound respect for solar energy, known as the Aten.
And so returning to this was a big threat to the Amun priesthood. And so they plotted to take Amarna down.
They eventually brought him down, and they destroyed his city, and they reinstalled the ancient gods, and with all their iconography.
Yeah, they simply destroyed everything, every trace of him. If they didn't find the ruins of Akhenaten's temples used as fill, rubble fill in the walls of Karnak, there'd be almost no sign of Akhenaten.
Amarna was a peaceful society with great creativity and beauty. Yet scholars in traditional Egyptology continue to portray Pharaoh Akhenaten as a deformed, renegade, heretical leader.
But seeing as a heretical king is quite the opposite. The heretics were the priests. He was not heretical. He, in fact, was somebody who was determined to adhere to the divine law. And he went to the cross for it.
After the fall of Akhenaten, Tutankhaten, a boy of only 9 years old, became pharaoh.
Now, because we found Tutankhamun's tomb intact, we know a lot about him and the life that he lived. Now, he was raised at Amarna. Now, some people say that Akhenaten was his father. We don't have DNA tests. We haven't found the mummy of Akhenaten. We don't know that for sure. But it's interesting that he started out as Tutankhaten, because at Amarna they worshipped the Aten. But after he took the throne, they opened the temples again. They moved away from Amarna. It seems that as soon as the Amun priesthood found out that he actually was of the Aten, he changed his name to Tutankhamun, that suddenly he disappeared.
After 10 years of leadership, when Tutankhamun was 19, he died mysteriously. His mummy was X-rayed, revealing a fractured skull, suggesting a blow to the back of the head.
It seems that he was buried in a rush. His tomb is very small, and close to it there were a whole lot of mummies that were moved in a cache and put aside. So it's almost like there were several mummies from other dynasties that were in the tomb that he ended up in, and then they took furniture from Amarna and buried him there.
Though the tomb of King Tut left us many clues, his fate remains a mystery. Another casualty of the patriarchal retelling of history is the story of Queen Hatshepsut.
Hatshepsut came earlier in the 18th dynasty. She started out by being a queen, and then she became pharaoh.
Hatshepsut was a wise and powerful leader who re-established trade networks with Egypt's neighbors, building the prosperity of the 18th dynasty.
She was certainly ruling for a long time at a period of tremendous peace and prosperity. The artwork was never better than under her reign.
Had she been male, she would likely have been remembered in history books as the best ruler of Egypt. Regardless of her success as a leader, she is still an enigma. There has been much controversy about Hatshepsut. It could be due to the patriarchy having little tolerance of images of an empowered woman. No one seems to agree on who the real Hatshepsut was.
There have been massive books written on Hatshepsut, and again there are no There are no real conclusions. Obviously, Hatshepsut must have been a very able ruler because she stayed there apparently 22 years.
But somehow, about 20 years after she passed, her statues were broken and all put into a pit. When they found them, they started putting them back together. But, like Akhenaten and Nefertiti, the Amarna period, they were largely forgotten because the people who came after were very threatened, and they somehow wanted to destroy all trace. Hatshepsut, Nefertiti and Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, they were the ones that really understood spirituality in some way. I suppose there was no money to be made if you weren't selling salvation.
We may never know how the high courts of ancient Egypt were run. It seems likely that the stories passed down through the patriarchal institutions of the 19th and 20th centuries may have misled us. The peace and prosperity of the 18th dynasty, particularly in the time of Hatshepsut, Nefertiti and Akhenaten, had to do with honoring the feminine in balance with the masculine. Looking at Egyptian artifacts and frescoes, it is clear that the feminine principle played a prominent role in society and was cherished and revered. The feminine principle was articulated in the concept of a great mother who was central to the ancient Egyptian worldview and was echoed by other world cultures.
The Milky Way in the sky is mythologized in various ways, in various traditions, in various cultures around the world. And it's often thought of, almost universally thought of, as a great mother principle, the great cosmic mother in the sky.
In ancient Egypt, biology met cosmology, and both were considered sacred.
When you look at the cosmology in terms of biology, is describing events that happen inside of a womb. And the womb happens to be the womb of the mother goddess.
In both Mayan and ancient Egyptian cosmology, the center of the Milky Way galaxy is where stars are born. Metaphorically, it is the womb of the great cosmic mother, represented as Isis, giving birth.
We keep looking at how the ancient Egyptians thought, and everything fed biology and procreation. How we got here, how we came into existence, biology, and then how we left, and how our soul continues to live. And we can see that there aren't really that many symbols that aren't pertaining to balance of the body, mind, and emotions, and to balance between the two hemispheres of the brain. Once we can embrace that, then it's easier to understand the Egyptians.
That switch from matriarchy to patriarchy, I think it's the cause of what's on the world now of conflicts and disagreement and showing off power. Yeah.
Already, the beginning of the first dynasty of ancient Egypt, Egypt was moving from being matriarchal to coming into more patriarchal ways of being and thinking. There were a few periods where the ancient knowledge was remembered, but it's important to remember that there was a lot of ancient Egypt prior to the dynasties and in the early periods that did not represent those values. So the parts of Egypt that I find the most interesting come from the memory of times that came further back.
I said many times that healthy people, they got the power, which is unhealthy people haven't got it. And I want you and all my friends and all my beloved to know that you have it. And when you know that, you will work on it to come bring it stronger. As I said before, the senses, just like muscles, if you don't use, it shrink and go.
We have been taught to think of Egypt as a civilization whose golden age occurred 2,000 or 3,000 years before Christ. Imagining this magnificent culture springing from small settlements in biblical times makes us wonder whether we've got the timeline right. World cultures have myths that speak of high levels of consciousness, superior science, art, and architecture from eons ago. How do we reconcile this? We are trapped in our own concept of time, but many cultures think on a vastly different scale. Science has established that the earliest human remains are about 2.5 million years old. It has shifted our marker back, so that now we are able to conceive of human culture being much, much older. In Indian traditions, and in 30 other cultures, a 26,000-year cycle is accepted. How does that affect the traditional chronology of Egypt, which insists that the pyramids were constructed as recently as 2450 BC? Will this force the issue of rethinking the chronology of ancient Egypt? Every year, authors, scientists, and alternative thinkers come together for the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. They share ideas about ancient cultures, lost knowledge, and great cycles of time.
I started the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge because I wanted to bring together the bright minds in this whole field of alternative history so we can put this very ancient puzzle back together again.
Geologists, physicists, engineers, and archaeoastronomers discuss the accepted dating of world history.
I'm convinced that there is a misunderstanding about the tenets of Egyptian civilization. And I'm convinced that there is misunderstanding about its datings.
To me as a geologist, it's unquestionable that the chronology has to be redone.
Knowledge of precession and advanced astronomy existed in extremely distant times.
So I think we're looking at a chronology that's far, far older than is accepted.
By integrating recent scientific discoveries in different disciplines, they define a new timeline of our past. The Egyptians provided us with concrete evidence that describes political events from a far more distant past than we can imagine. Why has this been overlooked?
The Egyptians themselves, in at least one stone tablet, the Palermo stone, and one papyrus, the Turin papyrus, they say that ancient Egypt is much, much older than the Egyptologists think it is. So to dismiss that is, of course, an assumption that contemporary Egyptologists know a lot more about ancient Egyptian history than ancient Egyptians do, which is a form of typical arrogance on the part of the academic community.
So why do we consider civilization to be only about 6,000 years old? Is it because of our limited imagination, or is there another reason?
Modern scholars tend to minimize the age because it fits better with the current paradigm of history. You know, the current paradigm is 5,000 years ago, man was hunter-gatherer. He had to have writing before he could build large structures or civilizations. He came together to protect himself from other warring parties and things like this. And so, for example, in Corral, Peru, when they found that amazing six-pyramid structure down there, they assumed it was built by the Incas, because that's only 500 years ago, and the Incas built most of South America. Well, when they got this very good carbon dating that shows it's 4,700 years old, it really blows a hole in current history theory. Generally, the academic community is just sort of silent about it right now because they don't have any good ideas with the current theories of history.
A cross-disciplinary approach helps us to put hard evidence and theory together to reach a greater understanding. If we consider the data coming from astronomy, geology, astrology, and climatology, we can arrive at new conclusions about the chronology of ancient Egypt.
We have two sciences that are playing with it. We have astronomy, we have geology. With the pyramids, we have a much more precise science. They've aligned the monuments. And they have the religious ideas locked to the machinery of the sky and the constellations and the sun and so forth. So we can use that with high precision and arrive at that date.
How does this information affect the dating of the Great Pyramid? Was it really built when Egyptologists say it was?
The traditional date for the Great Pyramid is about 2550 or so BC. You know, give or take. I mean, people argue about the dates, and some people want to date it down to a particular year. I think that's a precision that's not justified whatsoever.
I like to use the metaphor of painting a house. If you painted your house last in 2003, that doesn't mean your house was built in 2003. So I subscribe to the notion that there was probably quite a lot of work done on the Great Pyramid in 2450 BC, but that it probably was built quite a bit earlier than that. There's something very threatening about changing the dates because it takes us out of the patriarchal era. But I think that there was a whole world of Egypt that existed in matriarchal times, and I think the evidence is quite strong for that.
There is absolutely no reason at all why the ancient Egyptians could not have worked out the precessional cycle. How do we approach the age? Well, you have a variety of methods. When you're looking at an archaeological site, you have what we call the archaeological datings, which means you look at artifacts that you can fit into a chronology. You look at plot charts, stratas, but this can be very deceiving because it requires a lot of interpretation. Nonetheless, these are the methods that is predominantly used in archaeology. The other is carbon dating. Carbon dating is okay up to a point, and it's notoriously misleading if it's been contaminated and so forth. And besides, with many of these places, we do not have carbon datable material.
Carbon-14 dating works only on organic materials, but simply touching organic materials contaminates a sample. Stone cannot be carbon dated.
There is another form of dating, which is to use precessional astronomy.
What can we use to measure time? Are there markers that connect to the movement of the stars?
The stars would shift about 1 degree every 72 years.
It's not anymore in the same spot. Our planet is moving, but we can't feel it, not in the same position. And that was, it's in a change all the time. Nothing stands still. You know that our planet makes a cycle every 24 hours, sunrise every 24 hours, right? But our planet also revolve in a different way.
Precession is the motion of the axis of the Earth, which wobbles like a spinning top due to gravitational pull.
They make one round every 26,000 years.
If you have a monument, for example, let's take one that we know for sure, the temple of Isis at Dendra. It's a small temple behind the Hada temple. 99% sure aligned to the rising of Sirius. So if we have certainty that the temple has its axis aligned to the rising of a star, and we know which star it is, then we can date it. It's very simple, we do it in a matter of minutes. This is known as precessional astronomy. The star moves or appears to move because of the precessional wobble. We have a date.
Plato called a precessional cycle of 26,000 years a great year.
The great year is Plato's term for this vast cycle of time, one eon, one precession of the equinox. It's about 24,000 years. And there's over 200 myths that talk about this cycle of alternating dark and golden ages, or that make reference to a golden age in the distant past. 30 different cultures have passed down these myths from time to time, and they all related to the movement of the stars, which we know today as precession. Even Sir Isaac Newton himself wrote a book on it, trying to match history to each of the constellations of the zodiac, and it was wiped out by the Darwinian evolution paradigm, which came along, you know, less than 200 years ago, where it became unacceptable to admit that a culture that lived long, long before us might know something that we don't know.
On different continents, cultures have come up with the same ideas.
There's a certain science of cycles that's embedded into the world age doctrine of the Maya. You find it nicely paralleled in Egyptian ideas, as well as the Hindu world age doctrine known as the Yugas. And it's somewhat counterintuitive to what we've learned in our own Western education, that it's referred to as the myth of progress, that human beings today are in all ways superior to human beings that came before. It's simply not true. Cycles go through periods of increase and periods of decrease.
Mayan daykeepers are descendants of the ancient Mayan people and monitor the sacred calendar. Each day has certain qualities and gods. Daykeepers follow the movement of planets, eclipses, and astrological alignments. They are often trained shamans who do divination ceremonies, giving daily and monthly forecasts.
The Maya calendar is really interesting because it's based on a lunar rhythm. And the core building block of the sacred calendar is this 260-day cycle. Maya daykeepers today will offer as an explanation for this that it corresponds to the human gestation period. It's roughly 9 months. So all human beings share this primal rhythm of unfolding based upon the lunar cycle. And that's a real interesting key to what you might say, the Mayan time philosophy.
There are many ways of dividing time. Solar cycles, lunar cycles, and larger cycles of time. The Mayans devised their long count calendar, which combines a cycle of 20 named days with another cycle of 13 numbers to produce 260 unique days. Each of the 20 days is linked to a different god in Mayan mythology. The Great Cycle started in 3114 BC and ends in December 2012.
Well, the long count calendar is the most interesting calendar that the Maya had devised. This is of great interest in our times because this large cycle in the long count calendar, this period of 13 Baktuns, ends in 2012. So there's a great interest in figuring out why the early Maya skywatchers picked 2012 to end this large cycle of time.
The Mayans were excellent calendar makers. They intercorrelated the movements of the moon, the sun, and even Venus to make their calendars very precise. And for some reason, they have their long count calendar, the Baktun, ending here in 2012. So it seems perhaps they're trying to call attention to something.
Many people have been talking about 2012 as a turning point. What is the significance of this date?
In the years around 2012, the December solstice sun will be lining up with the center of our Milky Way galaxy. This is a rare alignment in the great cycle of the precession of the equinoxes, this 26,000-year cycle. Now, another thing that's interesting about this period of the 13 Baktun cycle that began in 3113 BC and ends in 2012 is its midpoint, 550 BC. This is a time when great world teachers appeared on the stage of history. Pythagoras among the Greeks, the Buddha, Zoroaster among the ancient early Persians. So there's also something to be said for the way that the long count divides up time in a certain way that defines periods in human culture, dawn points, high noon points and end points.
A carved stone, or stela, describing the long count calendar, was discovered at Ixapa in Mexico. It shows the center of the Milky Way, the celestial pole, and the sun deity. Why was this important to the Mayans?
It's really a beautiful and profound way of conceiving time. And in my research, as I've looked at Ixapa, the origin place of the 2012 calendar, I've been able to see how the Mayan wisdom, it's not just some provincial belief system of a forgotten people. It actually is like a little doorway that opens up into the great spiritual insights that all of the great traditions share. In Egypt, in India, Islam, all the world's great spiritual traditions share these same universal, eternal spiritual principles. And it has to do with cycle endings.
Just like the cycles of birth, life, and death, within the 26,000-year cycle, referred to as the Great Year, there are extended periods of darkness and light. These are divided into distinct ages, known as the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age.
The ancients themselves told us that history, mankind would go into a dark age. 4,000, 5,000 years ago, they view the past as the Golden Age. They see themselves moving into the Dark Age, and they dread it because they know that things are going to get worse, they're going to get chaotic. Cultures all around the world are talking about this pre-Dark Age, that things are going downhill.
I really ascribe to the Mayan and the Hindu idea that the Golden Age, the time of connection into the divine wisdom, was actually a long time ago. And we've been moving through periods of increasing densification, increasing alienation from the spiritual light.
Golden Ages are times of enlightenment, when civilizations reach high points in architecture, spirituality, and benevolence. This is considered to decline slightly in the Silver Age, further deteriorating in the Bronze Age, and reaching extreme levels of chaos, corruption, and ignorance in the Iron Age or Dark Age. Then the cycle works its way back up to the next Golden Age. One of the ways to measure the 26,000-year Yuga cycles is through the ages of the zodiac, which the ancient Egyptians clearly understood.
The origin of the zodiacal signs is a very good question, actually, and probably impossible to determine. The only one of the signs that vaguely looks like what it's supposed to is Leo the lion. The stars making up Virgo definitely don't look like a virgin, whatever a virgin looks like these days. And the other signs are equally mysterious, the crab, the bull, etc., etc. Knowledge of precession and advanced astronomy existed in extremely distant times. The basis of the signs themselves, in terms of zodiac, the wheel of life or the wheel of animals, there are different translations of that. I mean, if you really want to know what the signs signify, you have to go into the qualities and properties of the signs themselves. In other words, each sign is male or female. Each sign is fire, earth, air, water.
Each of the 12 signs of the zodiac has distinct energies. There are 4 elements: earth or material signs, air or intellectual signs, water or emotional signs, and fire or creative signs. By looking at the 12 zodiacal ages of about 2,000 years each, we can rethink the Egyptians' concepts of time and recreate the chronology.
There is a gap in our historical record.
The Palermo stone and the Turin papyrus are evidence from the Egyptians themselves and convey information from rulers far back in Egyptian history.
And they give the regnal years and the name of each of these rulers. And when you compute all of those names and put the numbers together, you get a date somewhere around 36,000 BC. At the same time, roughly, that 34,000 year date corresponds to the Vedas of India, the Vedic civilization of India, which also gives a date which, when you work it out, comes out to something like 40,000 years before our current era. So we have two great sophisticated civilizations that have documented their own belief that their civilization started back around that kind of time.
It is interesting to note that this is roughly 1.5 precessional cycles ago, dating back to a previous golden age.
The Sphinx, with its lion body, screams out as a Leo symbol, as a marker for an age of Leo. The last age of Leo had its ingress at around 10,500 BC. So that's the date favored by Graham and by Robert Bauval. I'm hesitant to accept that date myself because the last ice age comes to a catastrophic end somewhere around 11,500 BC. I mean, it certainly followed, and this is known, there are the quaternary extinctions. All the mammoths and the woolly rhinoceroses die all over the world. Siberia, which was temperate, becomes tundra and Arctic. North America, which was under a couple of miles of ice sheet, melts, and all that water goes into the sea. The sea rises 300 feet over the course of a couple of thousand years, but in stages, and some of those stages very precipitous, maybe corresponding to the biblical flood and possibly Plato's Atlantis myth. So under these circumstances, which are catastrophic the world over, to me, it seems unlikely that the Sphinx and the pyramids, which presuppose a settled and stable and sophisticated society, could have built those amazing structures under those kinds of conditions. So that leaves anything before 10,500 BC, but I like the idea of the Leo symbolism. So the next age of Leo back is 26,000 years earlier, and that puts it back at around 36,000 BC, which, outrageous as it sounds, by a process of exclusion, turns out to be maybe less outrageous because there are big problems with those other later dates.
Looking at the weathering on the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure, that weathering was clearly formed by runoff from precipitation.
It is indeed water weathering and precipitation induced, so it has to have been done in the distant past, and the question then is, how distant was that past?
It could take tens of thousands of years for the Nile to have migrated 8 miles. Can we use this evidence to redate these monuments?
When you look at geology, you can see that the riverbed has migrated all the way from the west, beyond 50 kilometers to the west. Then it passed across the plateau, and you can see that the ancient riverbed actually went right up to the pyramids, and the initiates could have stepped right off these barges up onto the causeways into the pyramids. Now, if you look, the Nile is a full 8 miles to the east, and it's the dividing point between Cairo and Giza. And so if we look at geological time, it would take several tens of thousands of years in order for the Nile to make that migration. We can compare that to places like Tiahuanaco in Bolivia that almost certainly was on the edge of Lake Titicaca, and now it's 50 miles away. So it changes the whole idea of how ancient these places could have been.
How many thousands of years does it take for a river to make this huge journey? The oases of El Khaga and Fayoum run parallel to the Nile today, but 100 kilometers west. It seems that the river migrated all the way from here to its current course. Evidence of ancient human settlements has been found in the area that is now desert, but once had water. At these locations are stone circles, indicating a knowledge of astronomy. What does it tell us about the distant past? What can we conclude about the dating of the pyramids and the Sphinx?
And all I can really say at this point, given the data I have, is that I think it has to be at least back to 5000 BC. Could it be older? In fact, might it well be older? Yes. Generally, if sort of pressed for dates, I'll say my best estimate is somewhere in the period of 7000 to 5000 BC. So that's really a working range that I'm comfortable with. We're also finding elsewhere in Egypt and around the world that other things were happening in that same period, 7,000 to 5,000 approximately BC, that to me puts the Sphinx into a larger regional and global setting, that it's not just an isolated thing. It doesn't seem as isolated as it did 15 years ago when we had less knowledge. You come to tentative conclusions. If more data comes in that seems to indicate something else, I don't ever want to be afraid to change my conclusions or go where the evidence takes me.
I'll stick with my extreme 36,000 BC date until proved otherwise, and if proved otherwise, I will change my mind.
How can we tie the concept of the Yuga or Vedic cycles into something more concrete that we can recognize in our own history? If we re-examine the stories that are often dismissed as fanciful myth, we might find that it indicates greater forces in play.
Those of us that are seriously looking at this old Vedic concept of the world ages, the cycle, we know that the golden age, the last golden age, basically the peak of the cycle was about 11,500 BC, highest point. We also know that Plato mentions a series of catastrophes which have come down to us as the Atlantis legend, in which he claims that on our calendar system it would have been around 9500 BC. Some tremendous upheaval apparently occurred, a lot of destruction. Isn't it also possible that for all of those maybe several thousand years, whatever those catastrophes were so cataclysmic that even with that silver age or golden age consciousness, they weren't fully able to recover? The end of the golden age and the decline into the falling silver age, or what we would refer to as mental age, marked the time at which we were falling out of a state on this planet where the average person had the potential or capability to be in a state, a very high state of awareness. And they were a far more enlightened and benevolent society than we would be able to even imagine now, but they were beginning to lose that almost divine state that exists in the Golden Age. And as they started to descend into the Silver Age, there began to be more of an emphasis on what we would now refer to as sacred sites and sacred structures.
You could almost think of them as machines to enhance consciousness or to create an environment where, you might call it altered states of experience, but changes in consciousness, expansion of consciousness.
What these were really intended to do, it wasn't so much for the selfish purpose of, for example, boosting up a few individuals. This actually had to do with a much larger global perspective. And that's effectively what the Great Pyramid was. It was basically a device, a generator for, if you will, broadcasting and transmitting throughout the planetary structure, a type of field which uplifted the entire humanity. For at least 1,000 years, this structure performed beautifully. My guess is that it probably did a lot to help offset the fall into the Dark Ages. And I think what the pyramids did is that for those individuals that were at least somewhat receptive, it kind of kept that energy polarized into the higher centers.
This is very real, and I think this is very important. It's like great art or great spiritual insight, expansion of consciousness. In a way, there's nothing more important than that.
It couldn't do it forever because eventually Mother Nature is going to win out, and this cycle is part of nature. It's as much a part of the natural world as day and night are. We have the ability to grasp those electromagnetic forces and the more fundamental forces that underlie those, who basically prop up humanity for a while using the system. Now the pyramids only have a very direct effect if you're close to them, which is the way it is in this age. You know, if we go stand in the pyramid, we might feel an effect like that. But I suspect thousands of years ago, you didn't have to be near it. I think it was probably a global effect.
The physical structure could only do so much. The wisdom keepers created social structures as an additional influence to extend the energy of the Golden Age by creating mystery schools that preserved the ancient knowledge.
The whole idea of the schools of mystery and the ancient knowledge and preserving those traditions that had come down from those fabulous ages, that was lost. And then eventually it was ridiculed, and then finally it had to go underground because people would either actively burn those texts or, you know, persecute the people who had that belief system. And I think at that point we were in the Dark Ages.
The exact end of the cycle of darkness is approaching. Each winter solstice before 2012, our sun comes into close alignment with the galactic center. This means we are beginning to feel the shift of energy already, even though the exact conjunction is December the 21st, 2012.
So all signs point to the interpretation that we are deep into the period of increasing darkness. What happens at the end of that downward trend is a turnabout. And I believe that that's where we are right now in history. The Mayan material for 2012 basically indicates this turnabout point, this point of maximized spiritual darkness. But then in the cycles of time, we turn the corner, and we have an opportunity to open up to the transformational energies that can sweep us into the next cycle.
I hope that the Mayan ancestors trying to interpret the few writings that are left are correct, that it means there's going to be some quickening or something like that. Because that would actually go with our latest understanding of the yugas. What a yuga cycle really is one precession equinox. And you know, using these later scholars' interpretation, we're actually in the very early stages of consciousness accelerating.
It has to do with the opportunity that we have to open up to the divine wisdom, to the transformational energies. But it always comes down to free will. Nothing is predetermined. It always comes down to a choice that we all have to close down in fear, succumb to fear, close down, become more limited in our consciousness, or open up to the blessing of the connection to the higher wisdom that is symbolized in the Maya tradition by the galactic center, the womb of the Great Mother, that which can transform and renew.
Could the ancients have had it right? Perhaps we should consider that we too can return to high levels of consciousness, heightened perception, and inspired creativity. It would serve us well to embrace nature and to protect the planet's environment. Can we go beyond religious dogma and allow ourselves to imagine what lies beyond death? How would humanity change if, instead of material wealth, consciousness was our highest value? The ideas depicted in the Pyramid Code revolutionize accepted beliefs about the purpose and the age of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Clearly not tombs, these ancient structures may have been used to access and transmit a type of energy that affects human consciousness. We have seen concrete evidence of high-level technology with laser-cut crystals, polished black basalt floors, and curious and sophisticated instruments, including those that generated energy from sound and light. Looking at the old riverbed, it seems clear that the Nile has migrated over time, and that it once flowed to the east of the pyramids. The ancient Egyptians built temples using sacred geometry corresponding to cavities in the human body. They had a profound belief in the significance of the stars and how the patterns of the constellations corresponded to our place in the cosmos. They understood large cycles of time, and they kept meticulous records of the motion of the stars and planets. The ancients had a deep respect for the sacred feminine principle and the importance of balancing the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine. From pre-dynastic to dynastic times, the ancients maintained a deep reverence for nature. They were astonishingly creative and artistic. From clues left on temple walls, it seems clear that our Egyptian ancestors accessed altered states of consciousness. Their primary concerns were how we arrived in our earthly bodies, described in terms of biology, and what happened when we left our earthly bodies, described in terms of cosmology. Our ancestors left clues embedded in symbols that had multiple layers of meaning. They were empowered humans, using the full capacity of their senses. Today, our planet is in trouble politically, economically, environmentally, and morally. Many will agree that corrupt people hold places of power. Citizens are taxed beyond reason, and riches are amassed by an elite that controls the world. With all this evidence of the sophisticated science left by the ancients, can we still uphold the belief that we are the most advanced society that has ever existed on planet Earth? Is today's test-driven education system effective? Instead of rote memorization of facts, what would happen if today's youth were taught to expand their capacity to know? If we were taught to seek truth and justice, living by the ancient law of Ma'at, how would our society change? Taking our cue from the ancients, if we live in tune with nature, in an atmosphere of creativity and peace, and if we connect to spirituality, is this the answer to a healthy future for humanity? The ominous date of December the 21st, 2012, is fast approaching. Does this herald doomsday, or could it be a powerful gateway into new ways of being and thinking? Are we turning the corner and ascending out of the age of darkness to journey toward a new golden age? Is it possible that the ancients living in a golden age in the distant past were able to see into future cycles of time? Could they have predicted that humanity would plummet into the depths of collective despair? Could they have predicted that humans would be disempowered, thus losing their connection to spirituality? Did they leave magnificent structures skillfully aligned to the stars and encoded with symbols to act as a trigger for us to wake up now? It seems humanity is at a crucial juncture as we approach 2012. Are we ready to walk forward into a new future? Have we finally cracked the pyramid code?
Wake up! We have it. We got it. Just know that we have it. And it works.